The wolf's yellow eyes locked with Samuel McKenna's as they faced each other in the breaking dawn. Its breath clouded in the crisp Wyoming air, fangs bared in a final defiance. Samuel's rifle remained steady, despite the blood on his hand from where the beast had caught him minutes earlier. The animal had taken down one of his best calves, and Samuel had tracked it for over an hour through the frost-hardened grass. "Nothing personal," he muttered, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed across the vast emptiness of his land, startling a flock of crows into flight. The wolf collapsed, its wild spirit extinguished in an instant. Samuel approached cautiously, knife drawn to ensure the predator was truly dead. As he knelt beside the animal, he noted its thinness, the jutting ribs beneath matted fur. A lone hunter, just like him. "Both of us just trying to survive," he said to the silent corpse as he began to skin it. The pelt would fetch a decent price in town, and Samuel McKenna wasn't a man to waste anything, not in this unforgiving country. The rising sun cast long shadows across his 2,000 acres as he worked. 3 winters had passed since Martha's death, 3 winters of emptiness and silence in a house built for a family. The ranch hands helped during the day, but they returned to their own homes each evening, leaving Samuel with nothing but memories for company. He wiped the blood from his hands and stared at the horizon. Wyoming Territory, 1872, a land of opportunity for some, a place of exile for others. For Samuel, it had been both. The Homestead Act had given him this land after the war, a chance to build something new, far from the blood-soaked battlefields where he'd served as a Union scout. Samuel bundled the wolf pelt and headed back toward the house. The old place needed work, shingles loose on the roof porch steps, creaking fence posts leaning drunkenly in places. Martha would have made a list of repairs, gently reminding him each morning. But Martha was gone, taken by consumption before her 35th birthday, her delicate frame no match for the disease that ravaged her lungs. Inside the house, everything remained as she had left it. Her quilts on the beds, her dishes in the cupboard, her Bible on the nightstand. Samuel dropped the bloody pelt by the door and moved to the stove, lighting it mechanically. Coffee and salt pork would do for breakfast, as it had every morning since her passing. As he ate at the worn kitchen table, he unfolded the letter that had arrived yesterday. The bank's letterhead seemed to mock him with its fine engraving. "Final notice," he read aloud to the empty room. "Improvements must be made. Productivity increased. Loan repayment schedule accelerated." Samuel crushed the paper in his fist. Without Martha to keep the books and manage the household, the ranch had slipped. Cattle lost to wolves, and harsh winter's fields untended, repairs neglected. One man couldn't do it all, not even a stubborn bastard like him. The solution had come from John Carter, owner of the general store in Cedar Ridge. "Matrimonial agencies," Carter had suggested, sliding a pamphlet across the counter last month. "Plenty of women back east looking for husbands out west. Respectable women, mind you. Women who understand hard work." Samuel had scoffed initially. The idea of replacing Martha seemed a betrayal. But as winter approached and the bank's threats grew more insistent, practicality overcame sentiment. He needed help, not just any help, but a woman's touch around the place, someone to tend the garden, keep the house, manage the accounts while he handled the cattle. That night, by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, Samuel McKenna composed his letter to the Hartman Matrimonial Agency in Chicago. His penmanship was cramped but legible, each word chosen with care. "Rancher 43 seeks wife. Requirements slim, build obedient nature, industrious disposition. Age 25 to 35 preferred. Must be willing to endure frontier life without complaint. No frivolities or Eastern airs." He'd been specific about wanting a slim woman. It was practical, he told himself. Life out here demanded agility, climbing into wagons, mounting horses, squeezing through fence gaps to rescue stuck calves. A slight woman would manage better, require less feeding. If he was honest, though, the request had more to do with Martha. She had been delicate, bird-like almost, and Samuel had felt needed when he lifted heavy things for her or reached items from high shelves. Her fragility had made him feel strong, protective. It was what a man wanted someone to shelter from the harsh world. Before sealing the envelope, Samuel glanced at Martha's photograph on the mantel. Her pale oval face smiled back at him, eyes luminous even in the faded image. "Forgive me," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was asking forgiveness for seeking to replace her or for waiting so long to do so. 2 months passed. Samuel prepared the house as best he could, patching the roof, fixing the sagging porch, mending the iron bed frame that had squeaked something terrible. He'd never noticed the sound when Martha was alive. She never complained. But now he found himself considering a stranger's comfort, wondering what this unknown woman would think of his rough homestead. The territory had grown tense in recent weeks. Rumors circulated about Sioux warriors attacking homesteads to the north. The railroad had brought more settlers pushing deeper into lands the tribes considered their own. Samuel kept his rifle closer than usual, even when working near the house. Tom Bradley, whose ranch bordered Samuel's to the west, had laughed openly when he heard about the matrimonial agency. "Mail-order brides, Sam," Bradley had mocked his substantial belly shaking with amusement. "What's next? You going to order your cattle from a catalog, too?" Bradley had never served in the war, a fact Samuel resented whenever the man flaunted his success. While Samuel had been dodging Confederate bullets, Bradley had been expanding his holdings, marrying a banker's daughter, and fathering 4 strapping sons. Now he ran the largest cattle operation in the county, and never missed a chance to remind smaller ranchers of their precarious position. "You'll be selling to me soon enough," Bradley had predicted more than once. "This land's meant for men who can handle it." The morning the train was due arrived crisp and clear. Samuel dressed in his best clothes, the same suit he'd worn for his wedding to Martha. It smelled of cedar and mothballs tight across the shoulders after years of ranch work had broadened his frame. Cedar Ridge Station was a modest wooden structure, little more than a platform and ticket office. Samuel arrived an hour early, pacing the boards until the station master asked if he was feeling ill. When the distant whistle finally announced the train's approach, Samuel's mouth went dry. He removed his hat, ran a hand through hair more gray than brown now, and stood straighter. The locomotive wheezed to a stop, black smoke billowing into the crystalline air. Passengers began to disembark, a traveling salesman with his sample case, a few ranch hands returning from a cattle drive, a minister clutching his Bible. The stream slowed, and Samuel's chest tightened. What if she'd changed her mind? What if the agency had made some mistake? The conductor was checking his pocket watch when one final passenger appeared in the doorway. Samuel's breath caught, then escaped in something close to dismay. The woman struggling to navigate the narrow steps with her worn valise was nothing like what he'd expected. Where he'd pictured a delicate wildflower, here stood a full-bloomed rose, curved and substantial. Her traveling dress strained slightly at the seams, and she stood nearly as tall as Samuel himself. Margaret O'Brien, for this had to be her, paused at the top of the steps, scanning the platform. Her face was handsome, rather than pretty, with strong features and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dark hair escaped from beneath her bonnet in unruly curls. When her gaze found his, she lifted her chin with a pride that made Samuel's stomach sink further. But what truly caught his attention was the shotgun case she carried alongside her valise and the tool belt visible beneath her half-open traveling coat. "Mr. McKenna." Her voice carried the faint lilt of Irish ancestry though her accent was pure Boston. "Miss O'Brien!" He removed his hat, acutely aware of the station master watching from his window. "I'll get your trunk," he said, looking past her for additional luggage. "Everything I own is in it," she replied, managing the last step with more grace than he'd expected for a woman of her build. She held up the valise and shotgun case. "These are all I brought." The silence stretched between them as he took her bag, heavier than it looked. Samuel jerked his gaze away, heat creeping up his neck. "The wagon's this way," he muttered, leading her around the station. She climbed up without waiting for his assistance, settling her skirts with practiced efficiency. As he joined her on the seat, the wagon creaked ominously, and he found himself calculating whether the axles would hold for the 10-mile journey home. They rode in uncomfortable silence for the first mile, the only sounds the horses' hooves and the whisper of wind through the sage. "The agency said you were a widower." Margaret finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "How long?" 3 years come winter." "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded curtly, keeping his eyes on the rutted road. "The agency said you were—" He couldn't finish, couldn't find a polite way to say you were supposed to be slim. "That I was 28 and seeking a new life in the West," she supplied evenly. "Both true, Mr. McKenna." The edge in her voice made him glance sideways. Her jaw was set, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew what he'd been trying to say. Of course she knew. They passed the Turner Ranch, where Ben Turner was mending fence with his boys. Samuel saw them stop working to stare, saw the eldest nudge his brother and whisper something that made them both grin. By evening, every ranch within 20 miles would know that Sam McKenna's mail-order bride had arrived, and she was nothing like what he'd ordered. "It's a hard life out here," he said stiffly, feeling the need to fill the silence. "I hope the agency explained that." She shifted on the seat, and he felt the wagon sway slightly. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. McKenna, despite what you might think looking at me." The directness of it startled him. Eastern women, in his experience, danced around things all gentle hints and downcast eyes. But then, nothing about Margaret O'Brien seemed gentle. "I wasn't—" he began, then stopped. He had been thinking exactly that. "The agency had your requirements," she continued, her voice steady, but with an undertone he couldn't identify. "Slim, obedient, hard-working. I suppose 1 out of 3 isn't what you hoped for." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Miss O'Brien." "Mrs. McKenna. Soon enough." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since leaving the station. "Unless you're planning to send me back on the next train." The question hung between them like a challenge. He could, he supposed, claim the agency had misrepresented things, demand they find him someone more suitable. But the thought of the gossip, the humiliation of sending away a woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him— "No," he said finally. "We'll make do." She laughed, then a bitter sound that made him flinch. Make do. How romantic. The rest of the journey passed in strained silence. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Samuel heard her quick intake of breath. He tried to see it through her eyes, the weathered buildings, the endless brown grass, the isolation of it all. The house looked particularly shabby in the harsh afternoon light, its unpainted boards gray as old bones. "It's not much," he said defensively. "It's fine." But her voice had gone quiet, and when he glanced over, her face had lost some of its defiant strength. He pulled up in front of the house, setting the brake with more force than necessary. His cattle dog Rex came bounding from the barn, barking a greeting that turned uncertain as he caught the stranger's scent. "That's Rex," Samuel said unnecessarily. "He's harmless." Margaret climbed down from the wagon again without waiting for help, and extended her hand for the dog to sniff. Rex's tail began to wag, and he pressed against her skirts, leaving dusty paw prints on the dark fabric. "Hello, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" Something in Samuel's chest twisted at the gentle tone. Martha had used that same voice with animals, that soft crooning that seemed to calm even the wildest creatures. He carried her valise inside, acutely aware of her following behind, taking in the sparse furnishings, the bachelor untidiness he hadn't quite managed to hide. She paused in the doorway of the bedroom, and he saw her notice the narrow bed, the single pillow. "I'll sleep in the barn until after the ceremony," he said quickly. "The preacher comes through next Sunday. We can make it official then." She nodded, still surveying the room. "And after?" He hadn't let himself think that far ahead, hadn't imagined sharing that creaking bed with anyone but Martha. Looking at Margaret's substantial frame, he wondered if the old mattress would even hold. "We'll work that out when the time comes," he said briskly. "Are you hungry? There's beans and salt pork, some cornbread from yesterday." "I can cook," she said, moving past him toward the kitchen. "If you'll show me where things are." He watched her explore the space, opening cupboards, checking the stove. Her movements efficient despite her size. She found Martha's apron on its hook and paused, her fingers hovering over the faded fabric. Was this hers? Yes. She left it hanging and rolled up her sleeves instead. "I'll need my own things, but this will do for now." As she worked, Samuel found himself backing toward the door, needing escape from this stranger who was suddenly filling his house with her presence, her scent, her substantial reality. "I need to check on the herd," he said. "I'll be back by dark." She didn't turn from the stove. "I'll have supper ready." Outside, he breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. What had he done? What had possessed him to think he could simply order a wife like a plow from a catalog? And what was he supposed to do with this woman who looked nothing like what he'd wanted, who spoke her mind, and moved through his house like she belonged there? From the kitchen window, he could see her silhouette moving about, already making changes, already claiming space. His neighbors would laugh themselves sick. Sam McKenna, who had been so particular about wanting a slim bride, had gotten himself a woman who could probably wrestle a calf to the ground single-handed. Rancher wanted a slim bride. Got himself a curvy one instead. He could already hear Tom Bradley saying it. The shame of it burned in his chest as he saddled his horse and rode out toward the upper pasture, fleeing the reality of what his loneliness had brought him. Behind him, smoke began to rise from the chimney. The first time in months, the house had shown such signs of life. But Samuel didn't look back. Couldn't bear to acknowledge that for all his disappointment, something in that cold house had already begun to thaw. Night had fallen by the time Samuel returned. He'd stayed away longer than necessary, checking fences that didn't need checking, counting cattle he'd counted yesterday. Anything to delay the inevitable return to the house and the stranger waiting there. The smell hit him first when he opened the door: fresh bread, roasted meat, something sweet he couldn't identify. The kitchen table had been set with Martha's good dishes, a kerosene lamp casting a warm glow over a meal finer than any he'd seen in 3 years. Margaret stood by the stove, her back to him. She'd found time to change into a simpler dress of deep blue, her hair now tamed into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. "You're just in time," she said without turning. "The biscuits are ready." Samuel hung his hat on the peg by the door, oddly unsettled by how she'd sensed his presence without looking. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble." She turned then, a platter of steaming roast beef in her capable hands. "I found the side of beef in the smokehouse. Hope you don't mind." He shook his head, suddenly aware of how hungry he was. They sat across from each other at the table, the silence broken only by the clink of utensils against plates. The food was good, better than good. Margaret ate with the same efficiency she seemed to bring to everything, neither picking daintily nor apologizing for her appetite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Samuel asked finally, more to break the silence than from genuine curiosity. "My father was a merchant in Boston," she replied, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. "We had a cook until the business failed. After that, I managed the kitchen." Samuel nodded, unsure what to say next. The awkwardness returned heavy as a physical presence between them. "I noticed your fences need mending on the east side," Margaret said suddenly. "And the chicken coop could use reinforcement before winter. Those foxes will get in otherwise." Samuel stared at her, taken aback. "You saw all that just riding in. I have eyes, Mr. McKenna." A slight smile softened her features. "And I grew up helping my uncle on his farm outside Boston. I know what to look for." Before he could respond, a noise from outside caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching at a gallop, then slowing to a walk. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping onto the porch, rifle ready. 3 riders approached through the darkness, their features indistinct in the faint moonlight. Samuel recognized the led horse before the rider, a distinctive black stallion with a white blaze. "Evening, McKenna," called a familiar voice, deep and mocking. "Thought we'd pay a neighborly visit to meet your new bride." Jake Morrison. The name alone was enough to make Samuel's jaw clench. Morrison led a gang of rustlers who'd been terrorizing the county for months, stealing cattle and horses with impunity. The law was too sparse out here to catch them, and most ranchers had taken to shooting on sight. "You're not welcome here, Morrison," Samuel called back, keeping his rifle visible. "Turn around and ride out." Morrison laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. He was a big man with a heavy beard and eyes cold as a winter creek. "That's not very hospitable, is it, boys? And me bringing a wedding gift and all?" His companions, a skinny youth with a nervous tic, and a squat, muscular man with an eye patch, chuckled on cue. All 3 were armed pistols, visible in their holsters. "I don't want anything from you," Samuel said evenly, "except your absence." "Now that hurts my feelings." Morrison's hand rested casually on his pistol. "Especially since we've got mutual friends." The hairs on the back of Samuel's neck rose. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you Tom Bradley sends his regards. Says you've been having money troubles." Morrison's teeth flashed white in the darkness. "Says that fancy bank in Cheyenne's breathing down your neck. Shame if something happened to more of your stock, isn't it?" Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger guard. So Bradley was feeding information to Morrison now. The threats were barely veiled pay for protection, or lose more cattle. Before Samuel could respond, the door opened behind him, and Margaret stepped onto the porch, a shotgun cradled in her arms. "Mr. McKenna." Her voice was steady. "Is everything all right?" Morrison's eyebrows shot up, and he let out a low whistle. "Well, well, the rumors were true. McKenna's gone and gotten himself a big one." His companions snickered, and the younger one made an obscene gesture. Samuel felt, rather than saw, Margaret stiffen beside him. Rage boiled up in his chest, not just at the insult to her, but at his own inability to protect her from it. "Get off my land," he growled, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Now." "Easy, McKenna." Morrison raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes remained coldly amused. "Just being friendly. We'll go. But remember what I said about Bradley. He's not a man you want to cross." He tipped his hat mockingly toward Margaret. "Ma'am, congratulations on your marriage. Hope you don't break him in half on your wedding night." The three riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, their laughter hanging in the air like gun smoke. Samuel lowered his rifle slowly, shame and anger churning in his gut. He couldn't bring himself to look at Margaret, to see the humiliation he'd subjected her to. "I'm sorry," he said stiffly to the darkness. "Morrison's a snake. Him and Bradley both." "Who were they?" Margaret's voice was surprisingly calm. "Jake Morrison leads a gang of rustlers. Tom Bradley owns the big spread to the west, fancies himself king of the county." Samuel turned to face her finally. "Bradley's been trying to buy me out for years. Seems he's gotten tired of waiting." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than offended. "They worked together then, the rustler and the rancher." "Appears so." Samuel was struck by how quickly she'd grasped the situation. "Bradley wants my land. Morrison wants a cut of the profits. Between them, they could make things difficult." "Well," Margaret checked the shotgun's action with practiced ease before lowering it, "they'll find I'm difficult too, if they try anything." Samuel stared at her, noticing for the first time the way she held the weapon not as an ornament or with nervous caution, but with the comfortable familiarity of long use. "Where did you learn to handle a shotgun?" A shadow passed across her face. "My father taught me. After the war, Boston wasn't always safe for a woman alone." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Samuel didn't press. They returned inside the easy atmosphere of dinner, destroyed by Morrison's visit. "I should check the barn," Samuel said, reaching for his hat again. "Make sure nothing's been disturbed." "I'll come with you." Margaret was already collecting a lantern. When he started to object, she fixed him with a steady gaze. "Two sets of eyes are better than one, Mr. McKenna, and I'm not afraid of the dark." Outside, the night had grown colder, stars pricking the black canopy overhead. They walked in silence to the barn lantern light bobbing ahead of them. Inside, the horses nickered softly, and the milk cow shifted in her stall. "Everything seems in order," Samuel said after a thorough check. He turned to find Margaret examining the ground near the back door. "Someone's been here," she said quietly, pointing to fresh boot prints in the dirt floor, too large to be Samuel's. "And recently." Samuel crouched beside her, cursing under his breath, as he recognized the distinctive pattern of Morrison's boots. "Must have been scouting while I was at the station. Checking what I've got worth stealing. Or just letting you know he can get close to your home," Margaret suggested, her voice grim. "Men like that want you afraid." Samuel looked at her sharply. There was something in her tone knowledge that went beyond theory. Before he could question her, a wolf howled in the distance, the sound echoing across the empty land. Another answered closer to the house. "They're hunting tonight," Margaret observed, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They're always hunting," Samuel replied, suddenly weary. "Everything out here is either predator or prey." "And which are we, Mr. McKenna?" The question hung between them as they returned to the house, leaving the barn secure behind them. Samuel had no answer, at least none he wanted to voice aloud. For 3 years he'd felt like prey, hunted by memories, by loneliness, by the slow collapse of everything he'd built. But tonight, with Morrison's threat hanging in the air and this unexpected woman at his side, something stirred in him that he hadn't felt since the war. A readiness, a tension in the muscles, the instinct of a predator sensing challenge. He glanced at Margaret's profile in the lantern light, strong, unafraid, so different from what he'd thought he wanted. Perhaps the Hartman matrimonial agency hadn't made a mistake after all. Perhaps they'd known exactly what Samuel McKenna needed, even if he hadn't known himself. "Good night, Mrs. McKenna," he said formally when they reached the house. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Good night, Mr. McKenna. She handed him a folded blanket she must have prepared earlier. I've made up a pallet in the hayloft. It should be comfortable enough until Sunday. Their fingers brushed as he took the blanket, and Samuel felt an unexpected jolt, like static electricity in winter. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, suggesting she'd felt it too, but she quickly turned away. I'll have breakfast ready at dawn, she said over her shoulder as she entered the house. Sleep well. Samuel stood on the porch long after the door closed behind her, the blanket clutched in his hands, his thoughts in turmoil. The woman inside was nothing like Martha, nothing like the bride he'd ordered. She was too tall, too sturdy, too opinionated, and yet watching her face down Morrison without flinching, seeing her handle a shotgun with easy confidence, he'd felt something he hadn't expected. Respect. In the barn, as he settled into the makeshift bed in the hayloft, Samuel found himself thinking not of Martha's delicate beauty, but of storm-gray eyes and capable hands. Of a woman who might be strong enough to survive in this harsh land, who might be able to stand beside him rather than behind him when danger came. It was a disturbing thought, and not one he was ready to examine too closely. Outside, the wolves called to each other, their howls carrying across the vast Wyoming night. Samuel listened, wondering which pack member was the prey they hunted and which would return to the den with blood on its muzzle. Predator or prey? The question followed him into uneasy dreams, where a woman with Margaret's face, but Martha's slight build, stood between him and a circle of wolves with Morrison's cold eyes. Dawn broke cold and clear over the McKenna ranch. Samuel woke to the familiar sounds of animals stirring below in the barn, the soft nickering of horses, the restless movement of the milk cow. For a moment, he lay still in the hayloft, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sleeping arrangement. Then, memory rushed back Margaret O'Brien, the mail-order bride who wasn't what he'd ordered. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from the house, reminding him that he was no longer alone on this land. Samuel groaned softly as he sat up, his back stiff from the makeshift bed. He'd slept poorly, troubled by dreams and the lingering threat of Morrison's visit. When he entered the kitchen, Margaret was already dressed and busy at the stove. She wore a simple work dress, her sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Her dark hair was pinned up, but a few rebellious curls had escaped to frame her face. "Good morning, Mr. McKenna," she said without turning. "Coffee's hot." Samuel poured himself a cup, struck again by how she seemed to sense his presence without looking. "You're up early." "Farm habits?" She slid a plate of eggs and bacon onto the table. "Hard to break." They ate in awkward silence until Samuel cleared his throat. "I need to mend the east fence line today. Some of the cattle broke through last week." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I saw your garden's overgrown. I could start there, get it ready for spring planting. And the chicken coop needs attention." Samuel frowned slightly. "The garden can wait. Martha always—" He stopped abruptly, the name hanging between them like an accusation. "I'm not Martha," Margaret said quietly, her gray eyes steady on his face. "I don't expect to replace her. But that garden needs work if you want vegetables next summer." The practical assessment disarmed Samuel's instinctive resistance. She was right. The garden had gone to seed after Martha's death, his own attempts at cultivation yielding pitiful results. "Do what you think best," he conceded, rising from the table. "There are tools in the shed." He spent the morning at the fence line, driving new posts into the hard ground and stretching wire between them. The physical labor helped clear his mind, the familiar rhythm of work, pushing aside uncomfortable thoughts about the woman now occupying his home. Around midday, he rode back to check on her progress, telling himself it was concern for his property, rather than curiosity, that motivated the return. What he found stopped him cold in the saddle. Margaret had transformed the overgrown tangle of the garden into neat rows, the soil turned and ready for planting. But it was her method that caught him off guard. She'd hitched his old plow to one of the draft horses and worked the ground herself, a task Samuel had always considered men's work too strenuous for a woman. She stood now by the horse's head, stroking its nose and murmuring praise, her face flushed with exertion, but satisfied. She'd removed her outer dress to work in her petticoat and blouse, practical in the growing heat of the day. The fabric clung to curves generous enough to make Samuel quickly avert his eyes. "You plowed the garden," he said, dismounting and approaching with an odd mixture of admiration and dismay. Margaret turned, pushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "It needed doing." "That's men's work." She raised an eyebrow. "So is cooking and cleaning, apparently, when a man lives alone." She patted the horse's neck. Old Thunder here didn't seem to mind who was holding the reins as long as he got an apple afterward. Samuel found himself without a ready response. She'd accomplished in a morning what would have taken him a full day, freeing him to focus on the fence line. It was practical, efficient, and yet it unsettled him to see her taking on tasks that Martha would never have attempted. "I've made sandwiches," she said, nodding toward a cloth-covered plate on the porch steps, "and there's coffee in the pot." They ate in silence, the midday sun warm on their backs. Rex, the cattle dog, lay at Margaret's feet, already won over by the woman who slipped him bits of meat when she thought Samuel wasn't looking. "How long have you had this place?" Margaret asked, finally breaking the silence. 7 years. Got it through the Homestead Act after the war." Samuel took a long drink of coffee. "It was nothing but raw land then." "You served in the Union Army." "Scout, mostly. I knew the territory." He offered no more, and she didn't press. After lunch, Samuel returned to the fence line, troubled by the morning's observations. Margaret worked with a strength and competence he hadn't expected, taking on tasks without complaint that would have overwhelmed a more delicate woman. It was practical, certainly, the work needed doing, and she was capable of doing it. But if she could handle men's work so easily, what did that make him? What was his role in this unexpected partnership? By the time he returned at sunset, these questions still churned in his mind. The smell of fresh bread greeted him, along with the sight of newly repaired chicken coops and a woodpile that had doubled in size. Margaret had clearly spent the afternoon with an axe splitting logs with the same efficiency she brought to everything. "That's man's work," he said again when he found her washing up at the pump, her sleeves rolled to reveal blisters forming on her palms. She dried her hands on her apron, her expression neutral. "You weren't here to do it, and it needed doing." "I would have gotten to it." His voice came out sharper than he intended. "When, after the fences, the cattle, the barn roof that's about to leak, and whatever else you're trying to manage alone." Margaret's calm cracked slightly. "Mr. McKenna, I didn't come all this way to sit with idle hands while watching you work yourself to death. I came to be a partner, not a decoration." The word partner caught him off guard. Martha had been his wife, his comfort, the gentle presence that made the house a home. She'd never been his partner, not in the way Margaret seemed to mean. "I ordered," he began, then stopped, aware of how petulant he sounded. "A slim, obedient wife. Yes, I know." Margaret's voice had gone cool. "What you got was me. You can keep wishing I was something else, or you can accept the help I'm offering. Your choice, Mr. McKenna, but the bank won't wait while you make up your mind." She turned and walked into the house, leaving Samuel by the pump, her words ringing in his ears. She was right, and that only irritated him more. The bank wouldn't wait. The work wouldn't wait. And Margaret O'Brien, for all that she wasn't what he'd ordered, was proving herself more valuable than he'd expected. That night, after another silent dinner, Samuel retired to the barn again, his thoughts in turmoil. 2 more nights until the preacher came. 2 more nights before he would be expected to share that narrow bed with a woman who challenged every assumption he'd made. He slept fitfully, waking before dawn to the sound of Rex barking frantically. Samuel grabbed his rifle and rushed from the barn, heart pounding. In the pre-dawn gloom, he could make out figures moving near the corral, 3 men attempting to lead away his best horses. Samuel raised his rifle and fired a warning shot. The figures scattered, racing for their own mounts tethered nearby. He fired again, aiming low, and was rewarded with a cry of pain as one of the rustlers fell. The front door of the house banged open, and Margaret appeared with her shotgun. She fired once, the blast echoing across the yard, and another rustler went down, clutching his leg. The third man, Morrison Samuel, recognized with grim satisfaction, managed to mount and galloped away, leaving his wounded companions behind. In the aftermath, as they bound the wounded rustlers and secured them in the barn to await the law, Samuel found himself looking at Margaret with new eyes. She'd responded to the threat without hesitation, her aim as true as any man's. "Where did you really learn to shoot like that?" he asked, as they walked back to the house, dawn now breaking around them. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her expression guarded. "My father wasn't just a merchant," she said finally. "After the war, he supplemented his income, carrying goods that weren't always strictly legal. He taught me to defend myself. A smuggler. He preferred independent trader." A small smile touched her lips. "But yes, when the business failed and he died, my brother inherited everything and a mountain of debt. There was nothing left for me except marriage to whoever would take a woman with no dowry and too much substance." Samuel absorbed this revelation, pieces falling into place. Her skill with weapons, her practical competence, the pride that kept her chin high even when faced with rejection. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "I know." She looked away. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be." The words surprised him as much as her. "Those horses you just helped save are worth 3 months' income. That's worth more than meeting expectations." It wasn't poetry, but it was honest, and the smile that briefly illuminated her face suggested it was enough for now. The sheriff arrived by midday to collect the prisoners, a grizzled man named Harkins, who'd known Samuel since his arrival in the territory. "Morrison's been getting bolder," Harkins observed as his deputies loaded the wounded rustlers into a wagon. "This is the 3rd attempt this month. Odd that he'd target you specifically, Sam." "Not so odd." Samuel nodded toward the western horizon where Bradley's ranch lay. "I think he has a partner with deeper pockets." Harkins followed his gaze, his expression hardening. "Bradley. I've suspected as much. Man wants to own the whole county." He glanced at Margaret, who was tending to a horse that had been injured in the commotion. "Your new wife handled herself well. The boys in town said she was unexpected." Samuel bristled slightly at the implied criticism. "She's exactly what I needed, turns out." The words felt strange in his mouth, but not untrue. Whatever he'd thought he wanted Margaret's presence had already saved his livestock and possibly his life. Harkins nodded, a knowing gleam in his eye. "Good. You'll need her. Morrison won't let this go, and if Bradley's backing him, they'll be back." After the sheriff departed, Samuel found Margaret in the barn applying a poultice to the horse's injured leg. Her movements were gentle, her murmured reassurances calming the nervous animal. "Sheriff thinks they'll be back," he said, leaning against the stall door. Margaret didn't look up from her work. "I know. Men like Morrison don't take humiliation well." We should be prepared. Samuel watched her capable hands as they wrapped a bandage around the horse's fetlock. Together. She glanced up at that surprise evident in her gray eyes. Together. You're a better shot than I expected, and you know horses. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with what felt like surrender. We'll need both skills if Morrison returns. It wasn't an apology, or an acceptance, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that whatever he'd ordered, what he'd received, might have its own value. Margaret seemed to understand the unspoken message. She nodded, a hint of that earlier smile returning. Together, then. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table planning defenses, which animals to move closer to the house, where to set watches, how to secure the barn against fire. The awkwardness between them had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something more like wary respect. When Samuel retired to the barn for his final night before the wedding, he found himself thinking not of Martha's gentle presence, but of Margaret's steady hands on a shotgun. Not of the bride he'd ordered, but of the woman who'd arrived instead, strong, capable, and perhaps exactly what his embattled ranch needed. Sunday dawned clear but cold, a hint of snow in the air despite the early season. Samuel dressed with care in his wedding suit, aware of the irony. He was marrying a woman he barely knew, whose very presence challenged everything he thought he wanted. Yet, as he watched Margaret emerge from the house in a simple blue dress, her dark hair neatly arranged, and a touch of color in her cheeks, he felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Not love, it was far too soon for that, but possibility. A future different from what he'd imagined, but perhaps no less valuable. The ceremony was brief, performed by a traveling preacher in their kitchen, with only the station master as witness. Samuel heard himself speaking, the vows, felt the weight of the simple gold band as he slipped it onto Margaret's finger, the same ring Martha had worn, which seemed wrong somehow, but was all he had. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher intoned. Samuel leaned in, meaning to brush her cheek, but Margaret turned her face, and their lips met briefly. Hers were softer than he'd expected, and warm. He pulled back quickly, disturbed by the unexpected flutter in his chest. After the modest wedding lunch Margaret had prepared, the guests departed, leaving them alone in a house that suddenly felt smaller than ever. They moved around each other carefully like dancers who didn't know the steps. As darkness fell, the question that had lurked all week demanded answer. "I suppose," Samuel began, then stopped, cleared his throat. "That is, you'll be wanting to move your things into the bedroom." Margaret stood by the stove, her back to him. "If that's what you want." "It's what's expected," he said roughly. "We're married now." She turned then, and he saw something in her eyes, fear, hurt, hope. It passed too quickly to identify. "Yes," she said quietly, "we're married." Later, lying in the bed that seemed to have shrunk by half, Samuel stared at the ceiling while Margaret settled beside him. The mattress dipped significantly under her weight, rolling him slightly toward the center. He grabbed the edge to keep himself in place, the bed frame groaning ominously. She lay perfectly still, barely seeming to breathe. The space between them might have been an ocean for all its vastness. Outside, a coyote howled, and Rex answered from the porch. The night sounds of the ranch continued, wind in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle. But inside, silence reigned. "I know I'm not what you wanted," Margaret whispered into the darkness. The words hung there, a confession and accusation, both. Samuel closed his eyes, wrestling with responses. Part of him wanted to deny it, to offer comfort. But the larger part, the part that still grieved for Martha, that still smarted from the town's amusement, couldn't form the lie. "We'll make do," he said, finally echoing his words from that first day. He felt, rather than heard her sigh, felt the minute shift as she turned away from him. The bed protested with a symphony of squeaks, and he found himself holding his breath, waiting for the final catastrophic crack that would send them both to the floor. But it held groaning, but steady like everything else in his life. Not what he'd wanted, but surviving, despite it all. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. He dreamed of Martha slim and laughing, dancing away from him across endless grassland, while behind him, something large and warm and infinitely patient waited in the shadows. The sandstorm struck without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Samuel had been checking the eastern pasture when the sky turned an ominous yellow-brown and the wind picked up with violent intent. He spurred his horse toward home, pulling his bandana over his nose and mouth as grit filled the air. By the time he reached the ranch, visibility had dropped to mere feet. The cattle were bellowing in distress, milling against the fence lines. Through the howling wind, he could barely make out the house, but what he saw made his blood freeze. Margaret was out by the barn, struggling to herd the milk cows inside. "Get to the house!" he yelled, but the wind tore his words away. She couldn't hear him, but she'd seen him. Instead of retreating to safety, she pointed urgently toward the chicken coop, where the door had blown open, hens scattering in panic. Without hesitation, she plunged into the storm. Samuel cursed and dismounted, fighting his way to the coop. Together, they battled the wind to round up the birds. Margaret's strong arms proving invaluable as she grabbed the panicked chickens and tossed them inside. Her hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face like dark snakes, but she didn't pause. "The barn door!" she shouted directly into his ear. "It's coming loose!" They stumbled through the blinding sand to secure the barn. It took both of them, throwing their combined weight against the door to get it closed and barred. Inside, the animals stamped nervously, and Samuel quickly checked all accounted for, including his prize bull. Margaret was already moving, her practicality taking over. She grabbed empty grain sacks and started stuffing them along the bottom of the door, where sand was already piling in. Samuel watched for a moment, struck by her quick thinking, before joining her effort. When they finally staggered into the house, they were both coughing, covered in dust. Margaret's dress was torn at the shoulder, and a small cut on her forehead bled sluggishly. Without thinking, Samuel reached out to touch it. "You're hurt." She jerked back, slightly surprised by the gesture. "It's nothing, just a scratch from flying debris." But he was already dampening a cloth, his movements gentle as he cleaned the wound. She stood still, and he became acutely aware of their closeness, the warmth radiating from her exerted body, the way her breath stirred the hair at his temple. "Thank you," he said gruffly, stepping back. "For the animals, that was... you did well." Something flickered in her gray eyes. "They're my animals too now, aren't they?" The storm raged for hours. They sat at the kitchen table sharing coffee and listening to the wind batter the walls. Without the usual ranch work to create distance between them, conversation came haltingly. "Where did you learn to handle livestock?" Samuel asked. "My uncle had a small farm outside Boston. I spent summers there as a girl." She smiled slightly. "He used to say I was built for farm work. Meant as an insult, I think, but I took it as preparation." "Why did you answer the advertisement?" The question had plagued him for weeks. Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago. My brother inherited everything, the house, the money, father's business. Edward's wife made it clear I was a burden. Too old to marry well. Too," she gestured at herself with bitter humor, "substantial to attract suitors willing to overlook my lack of dowry." Samuel felt an unexpected kinship. He understood being alone, understood the desperation that drove people to dramatic choices. "So you came west." "So I came west," she agreed, "to a man who wanted a slim, obedient wife." The words held no accusation, just weary fact. "I shouldn't have said that," he admitted. "About the workhorse. But you thought it." He couldn't deny it. "Yes," she nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. "At least you don't pretend otherwise. That's more than most would offer." The storm began to die as evening approached. When they ventured outside to assess the damage, they found several fence posts down and half the chicken coop's roof torn away. Without discussion, they set to work side by side. Margaret held posts steady, while Samuel handed him tools before he asked anticipated needs with surprising accuracy. As the sun set, painting the dust-hazed sky in shades of amber, Samuel's horse stumbled in a hidden hole. He went down hard, his knee twisting painfully beneath him. Stars burst across his vision as pain shot up his leg. "Samuel!" Margaret was beside him instantly, her strong hands surprisingly gentle as she helped him sit up. "Don't try to stand yet. Let me look." She probed his knee with careful fingers, her touch clinical but tender. "Not broken, I think, but you've wrenched it badly. Can you make it to the house if I support you?" Pride warred with practicality. The house seemed miles away, and his knee screamed with every movement. "I can manage," he gritted out, trying to rise. He made it 3 steps before nearly falling again. Without a word, Margaret ducked under his arm, taking his weight against her solid frame. She was exactly the right height, her strength evident as she practically carried him the remaining distance. "Martha couldn't have done this," he found himself saying, then immediately regretted it. Margaret's jaw tightened. "No, I suppose she couldn't have." Over the following days, as his knee slowly healed, Samuel experienced the strange reversal of being cared for. Margaret managed the ranch work he couldn't do, milking cows, feeding stock, even riding out to check the herd. She came back wind-blown and triumphant, reporting on new calves and mended fences. "That's too much for a woman," he protested from his enforced seat by the fire. She fixed him with a steady gaze. "Would you rather lose cattle? Or perhaps you'd prefer I fetch Tom Bradley to help? I'm sure he'd enjoy telling everyone how Samuel McKenna's too sturdy wife had to call for assistance while her husband sat idle." The thought of further humiliation silenced him. He watched her work, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she handled the animals with firm confidence. When she thought he wasn't looking, she'd pause to stretch her back or massage her shoulders, but she never complained. One afternoon, Billy Henderson and his sister Emma stopped by with their mother's regards and a basket of preserves. Samuel watched from the porch as Margaret charmed the children, letting Billy help with the chickens while braiding Emma's hair. Her laughter rang across the yard, rich and genuine. "Your wife's real nice, Mr. McKenna," Emma said shyly. "Not like Ma said. Ma said she was too big, but I think she's pretty, like a painting of a goddess we saw in a book." Out of the mouths of babes. Samuel saw Margaret's face flush, but she smiled at the girl. "That's kind of you to say, sweet pea." After they left, Margaret stood in the yard watching their wagon disappear. "Children see clearer sometimes," she murmured more to herself than him. That night, as she helped him navigate the stairs to bed, Samuel felt a shift in how he saw her. Not the delicate bird he'd wanted, but something else. A hawk, perhaps, fierce and strong, and built for survival in this unforgiving land. When she eased him onto the bed, her hands gentle on his injured knee, he caught her wrist. "Margaret, thank you for everything these past days." She stilled, looking down at him with those storm-gray eyes. "It's what wives do, Samuel. Even wives who aren't what their husbands ordered. There was no bitterness in it now, just a kind of sad acceptance. She pulled free and busied herself with removing his boots. But something had changed in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall he'd built around his expectations. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and Samuel thought about predators and prey, about strength and survival, about the different kinds of protection a man might need. His knee throbbed, reminding him of his vulnerability, of how quickly the tables could turn in this harsh land. And for the first time since Margaret had stepped off that train, he found himself genuinely grateful she was exactly who she was, sturdy, capable, and strong enough to hold him up when he couldn't stand alone. The trouble came on a moonless night in late October. Samuel woke to the sound of horses, too many horses for honest folk at this hour. He slipped from bed, reaching for the rifle he kept nearby, trying not to wake Margaret. But she was already sitting up alert, as any frontier woman learned to be. "How many?" she whispered. "3, maybe 4 riders." He was already pulling on his boots. "Stay inside. Bar the door behind me." "Like hell," she muttered, rolling out of bed and reaching for her own clothing. "You think I survived Boston's rough streets to cower inside while my husband faces thieves alone?" She was already loading the shotgun they kept in the kitchen. "Besides, they're after the horses. Your prize stallions are 3 months' income." Before he could argue further, a shout split the night. "McKenna, we know you're in there. Come out nice and peaceful-like and nobody gets hurt." Samuel recognized the voice. Jake Morrison returned with reinforcements. Through the window he could see torches moving near the barn. "They're going for the horses," Margaret breathed. "The barn's too far from the house. They'll have them out before we can stop them." She was right. By the time they reached the barn, the horses would be gone. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "Well enough to make them think twice." They slipped out the back door, using the darkness for cover. Samuel's heart pounded as they crept along the side of the house. He could see the rustlers now, 4 of them working to open the barn doors while keeping watch on the house. "I'll circle around," he whispered. "When I give the signal." A shot cracked through the night, splintering wood inches from his head. They'd been spotted. "So much for surprise," Margaret said grimly. And then she was moving. Samuel had never seen anything like it. She didn't run or panic. She strode forward like an avenging angel, shotgun raised. "That's far enough, boys," her voice carried across the yard with surprising authority. "First man who touches that barn door gets a belly full of buckshot." The rustlers laughed. "Well, well, McKenna's got himself a guard dog, a big one, too." "Better than a lap dog," she shot back. "Now step away from our property before I decide to test whether you bleed as red as honest folk." Samuel used her distraction to flank the group, but Morrison was no fool. He spotted the movement and fired. The bullet caught Samuel's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Pain exploded through him, hot and sharp. "Samuel!" Margaret's cry pierced the night. "Got your man, woman," Morrison jeered. "Now be smart and go back inside. Let us take what we came for." What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Margaret O'Brien McKenna, all 5'8", and solid muscle of her, charged not in panic or hysteria, but with the calculated fury of someone who'd found something worth fighting for. Her first shot took Morrison's hat clean off, sending him diving for cover. She worked the shotgun's action smoothly, laying down covering fire as she moved to stand over Samuel's fallen form. "You want these horses," she roared. "Come through me." Maybe it was the sight of her hair, wild eyes blazing, built like a Valkyrie from those old Norse tales. Or maybe it was the deadly accuracy of her shots. But the rustlers hesitated, and in that hesitation, their courage broke. "It ain't worth it, Jake," one called out. "She's crazy." "Crazy accurate," Margaret corrected, putting a shot so close to the speaker's boots that he danced backward. "My father was a Union sharpshooter. Taught me everything he knew. Want to test if I inherited his eye?" It was a lie. Samuel knew her father had been a Boston merchant, but the rustlers didn't. They were already backing toward their horses, Morrison cursing but following. "This ain't over McKenna," he shouted as they mounted up. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied steadily, "because if I see any of you on our land again, I won't aim to miss." They rode off in a thunder of hooves and wounded pride. Only when the sound faded did Margaret drop to her knees beside Samuel the shotgun, falling from suddenly trembling hands. Oh, God, you're shot. Samuel, can you hear me?" "I hear you," he groaned, trying to sit up. The movement sent fresh fire through his shoulder. "Did they? The horses are safe, all safe." Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined the wound. "Bullet went clean through. You're lucky, but we need to stop this bleeding." She half carried, half dragged him into the house, her strength the only thing keeping him upright. As she worked to clean and bind the wound, Samuel studied her face in the lamplight. There was blood on her cheek, his or hers he couldn't tell. Her hands were steady, but he could see the fear she was mastering, the determination that drove her. "You lied," he said, as she tied off the bandage. "About your father." "Yes." She didn't look up. "But they didn't know that." "You could have been killed." Now she did meet his eyes. "So could you. Did you think I'd stand by and watch it happen? Most women would have." "I'm not most women." She sat back on her heels, exhaustion suddenly showing. "I thought we'd established that. I'm too big, too strong, too much of everything you didn't want, Samuel. But I'm also the woman who just saved your horses and probably your life." There was no boast in it, just tired fact. "I'm the woman who chose to stand and fight instead of run. Because that's what you do when—" She stopped biting her lip. "When what?" "When you care about something. Someone." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Even if they wished you were someone else." Samuel reached out with his good arm, catching her hand. It was rough with work, strong and capable. Not the delicate bird's wing he'd imagined, but the hand that had held a shotgun steady, that had fought for him and their home. "I was a fool," he said quietly. She tried to pull away, but he held on. "Samuel, you're hurt. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I wanted a slim wife because I thought that's what I needed, someone delicate to protect. But this land—" He gestured weakly with his wounded arm. "This land doesn't care about our fool notions. It demands strength, partnership, someone who can stand beside you when the wolves come calling, literal or otherwise." Tears tracked down her cheeks, the first he'd seen from her. Don't say things you don't mean just because you saved my life. Because you've worked yourself raw to prove your worth. Because you faced down 4 armed men like some warrior goddess." His voice grew stronger. "Margaret O'Brien, McKenna, you broke every expectation I had. Thank God for it." She laughed through her tears, a watery sound. "Warrior goddess. Emma Henderson said something similar." "Smart girl." He tugged her hand. "Help me up. We should check the animals, make sure they're calm. You're going nowhere with that shoulder." "Then stay here with me." He kept hold of her hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the life pulsing through it. "Stay, and let me start seeing you." Really seeing you for the first time." Outside, dawn was breaking across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the barn, horses nickered softly, safe and sound. The rustlers were gone, driven off by a woman who'd refused to be what anyone expected, weak, helpless, slim. Margaret squeezed his hand gently, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Samuel felt like he was finally home, not in the house he'd shared with Martha's ghost, but in the presence of this remarkable woman who'd fought for him for their life together with everything she had. The fever came first, a burning that swept through Samuel's body like wildfire through summer grass. Margaret worked tirelessly, changing compresses, spooning broth between his cracked lips, murmuring reassurances when nightmares gripped him. In his delirium, he called for Martha sometimes, and for his mother, long dead. Once, he cried out for a man named Jenkins, his voice ragged with what sounded like guilt. Margaret never flinched, never reproached him for these slips into the past. She simply held his hand and promised him he wasn't alone. On the third day, when the fever finally broke, Samuel woke to find her slumped in a chair beside the bed, dark circles beneath her eyes, her strong hands raw from wringing out cold compresses. She had clearly not left his side for days. "Margaret," he whispered, his throat parched. She startled awake instantly, relief flooding her tired face. "You're back. Was I gone?" His attempt at humor fell flat as he saw the genuine fear in her eyes. The bullet wound got infected. She helped him drink from a cup of water. "You've been burning up for 3 days. I was afraid—" She stopped composing herself. "But you're better now. The fever's broken." Samuel studied her in the gentle morning light filtering through the curtains he realized she must have hung during his illness. The bedroom looked different, in fact. Cleaner, more organized. The chair she sat in hadn't been there before. "You've been busy," he observed. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Had to do something while watching you sleep. Besides, a sick room should be orderly." His hand found hers, squeezed gently. "Thank you." She looked away, that pride of hers still strong despite exhaustion. "It's what wives do." "Not all wives," he said quietly. "Not like this." The days of convalescence that followed changed things between them in ways neither could have anticipated. Forced inactivity made Samuel a reluctant audience to Margaret's management of the ranch. From his sickbed, then from a chair by the window, he watched her transform his struggling homestead with the same efficiency she'd brought to his household. She repaired the chicken coop, reinforced the barn, negotiated with Carter at the general store for better prices on supplies. When the first snow fell early this year, she weatherproofed the house and barns with a thoroughness that put Samuel's previous efforts to shame. Most surprisingly, she started a ledger, meticulously tracking expenses and income. One evening, she placed it on his lap as he sat by the fire, his shoulder healing but still sore. "We need to talk about the bank," she said, settling in the chair opposite him. Samuel tensed. The bank's deadline for their loan repayment was approaching fast. "I know we're behind. We're not just behind. We're in danger of losing everything." She pointed to her neat columns of figures. "But there's a way out if we're smart about it." She had identified inefficiencies in the ranch's operations, calculated exactly how much they needed to earn by spring, and devised a plan to get their selective breeding of the best cattle selling off the poorer stock. Now, before winter feeding became costly, diversifying with chickens and perhaps pigs. "Where did you learn all this?" Samuel asked, genuinely impressed. Margaret shrugged. "My father's business. I kept his books after Mother died. He didn't think a woman should worry about such things, but someone had to make sense of his accounts." And did you make sense of them? A shadow crossed her face. Not enough to save him from ruin, but I learned what not to do. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the first serious snowfall of the season blanketed the world in white silence. Morrison will be back, Samuel said, finally giving voice to the worry that had haunted him since the shooting. Margaret nodded, her expression grim. Yes, and not alone. He's a small man who's been humiliated. Those are the most dangerous kind. We need to be ready. We will be. She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. The winter will keep them away for a while. Give us time to prepare. Samuel watched her, straight-backed and strong against the gathering darkness, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not just gratitude or respect, but something warmer. Something he wasn't ready to name. The winter deepened, sealing them in a world of white and silence. With Samuel still recovering, they developed a routine, Margaret handling the outdoor chores in the morning, while he managed what he could, inside then together, in the evenings, planning for spring, playing checkers, reading aloud from the few books they possessed. Sometimes in the circle of lamplight, Samuel would look up to find Margaret watching him, her gray eyes thoughtful. When caught, she would quickly look away, a flush rising to her cheeks. At night, the narrow bed no longer felt confining, but comforting, her solid warmth, a reassurance in the freezing darkness. They didn't speak of these changes, didn't acknowledge the shifting currents between them, both perhaps too cautious to risk what fragile peace they'd found. But the world beyond their snowbound sanctuary had not forgotten them. The first sign came in a letter delivered by a half-frozen postman who stopped at the ranch seeking shelter during a brief break in the storms. Samuel recognized Bradley's handwriting on the envelope and felt his stomach knot. He waited until the postman had departed before breaking the seal, Margaret watching intently from across the kitchen table. "Bradley wants to meet," he said after scanning the brief message. "Says he has a proposition that could resolve our difficulties." Margaret's expression hardened. "He means to threaten us." "Probably, but we need to know what he's planning." "It's a trap, Samuel. You can't go." He looked up, surprised by the genuine fear in her voice. "I'll be careful." "No." She took the letter from his hands. "If anyone goes, it should be me. You're still healing, and they won't expect a woman." "Absolutely not. Bradley's dangerous, and Morrison will be watching. I won't risk you." She stood her height, impressive as she straightened to her full stature. "Risk me? After everything we've been through, you still think I'm something fragile to be protected?" "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Her eyes flashed. "You'd rather risk yourself, risk this ranch, our future, than acknowledge I might be better suited to handle Bradley." Samuel rose too, ignoring the twinge in his shoulder. "This isn't about who's more capable. It's about the fact that Bradley and Morrison want me, not you. They want my land, and they'll use any means to get it. Which is precisely why you shouldn't walk into their trap." Margaret's voice rose, her frustration evident. "Samuel, be sensible. If something happens to you, what becomes of the ranch? Of me?" The question hung between them, raw with implications neither had voiced. What was she to him really? A wife on paper, a partner in work. But what else? Before he could formulate an answer, a sound from outside caught their attention, the distant but unmistakable howl of wolves close to the ranch house. Too close. "The cattle," Samuel said, reaching for his coat. Margaret was already moving toward the door, pulling on her heavy boots. "They're in the north pasture. We need to bring them closer to the barn." Outside, the temperature had dropped precipitously, the earlier sunshine giving way to threatening clouds. They mounted the two strongest horses, Samuel wincing, as the movement pulled at his healing wound, and rode toward the pasture where the small herd had been grazing on winter hay. They found chaos. Wolves, a pack of at least 6, had cut 3 calves from the herd and were circling for the kill. The rest of the cattle had bunched together defensively, but panic was spreading. If the herd bolted, half would be lost in the gathering storm. Without hesitation, Margaret spurred her horse forward, shotgun in hand. She fired once into the air, the sound like thunder in the winter stillness. The wolves scattered momentarily, and she used the opportunity to position herself between them and the terrified calves. Samuel circled behind the main herd, using his horse to begin pushing them toward the home pasture. His shoulder burned with the effort, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. They worked in silent coordination, Margaret keeping the wolves at bay, while Samuel drove the cattle to safety. One wolf, bolder than the others, made a lunge for a calf. Margaret's second shot caught it mid-leap, the animal crumpling to the snow. The rest of the pack retreated, but remained visible at the edge of the trees, watching. "They're desperate," Samuel called over the wind, which was rising steadily. "The winter's been too harsh. They can't find game." Margaret nodded grimly, reloading her shotgun with gloved hands. "They'll be back tonight. We'll need to keep watch." By the time they had the cattle secured in the home pasture, snow was beginning to fall again. They worked quickly to distribute hay-check water troughs and ensure the gates were secure. The wolves had withdrawn temporarily, but their howls echoed across the valley as darkness fell, a promise of hunger that would not be denied. That night, they took shifts, watching over the herd from the barn. During his watch, Samuel found himself thinking about the letter from Bradley and about Margaret's reaction. She was right. Of course, it was almost certainly a trap. But the idea of sending her to face Bradley in his stead felt like a failure of his responsibility, not as a man, but as a husband. What kind of husband was he to Margaret? Not the one she deserved, certainly. He'd been cold, disappointed, judgmental. He'd mourned the bride he'd ordered, rather than appreciating the woman who'd arrived. Yet, she had saved him his life, his ranch, perhaps even his soul, more than once. When she came to relieve him for the second watch, wrapped in a heavy coat that emphasized her solid frame, Samuel found himself staring at her with new eyes. The lamplight caught the planes of her face, strong and handsome, rather than pretty, her gray eyes alert despite the late hour. "Any sign of them?" she asked, checking the shotgun she carried. "They're out there. I can feel them watching." He hesitated, then added, "About Bradley's letter. We can discuss it in the morning," she said firmly, "when we're both rested." "Margaret," he caught her arm as she moved past him, "I didn't mean to suggest you weren't capable. You're the most capable person I've ever known." She stilled her expression, unreadable in the dim light. But I can't bear the thought of you facing danger because of me. Not again." Her features softened slightly. "It wouldn't be because of you, Samuel. It would be for us. For this." She gestured toward the ranch, the cattle, the life they were building. "This is mine now, too. I'll fight for it just as hard as you will." The simple declaration, "This is mine now, too," struck Samuel with unexpected force. Of course it was hers. She had earned it through sweat and courage and sheer determination. She had claimed it not just through marriage, but through blood and effort. "We'll decide together," he conceded. "In the morning." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this compromise. As he turned to leave, she called after him, "Samuel, get some real rest. Your shoulder needs it." He smiled, despite himself. "Yes, ma'am." The wolves did not attack that night, though their howls haunted the darkness. When morning came crisp and painfully bright, Samuel found Margaret in the kitchen already dressed and cooking breakfast, her shotgun leaning against the wall beside her. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon before him, "about Bradley's letter." Samuel sat appreciating both the food and her directness. "And we should go together." She joined him at the table, her own plate modest compared to his. "Present a united front. Show him we're not intimidated." Samuel considered this as he ate. It wasn't a bad strategy. Bradley would expect him to come alone, perhaps weakened by his injury. The sight of both of them strong and determined might give the man pause. "It could work," he admitted, "but it's still dangerous." "Life is dangerous," Margaret responded with a slight smile. "Especially out here." Before they could discuss it further, a pounding at the door interrupted them. Samuel reached for his rifle and Margaret moved to the side of the window, peering out cautiously. "It's John Carter," she reported, surprised. "From the general store." Samuel lowered his weapon, but remained wary. Carter had always been friendly, but he was also known to be close with Bradley. The timing of his visit so soon after Bradley's letter raised suspicions. Margaret opened the door, greeting Carter with cautious hospitality. The storekeeper stamped snow from his boots, his breath clouding in the cold air. He looked troubled, his normally jovial face creased with worry. "Samuel, Mrs. McKenna." He nodded to them both. "Sorry to intrude so early, but I thought you should know Bradley's been asking questions about your land title." Samuel frowned. "My title is solid. I received this land through the Homestead Act." Carter shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it. Bradley's claiming there was an irregularity with your claim. Something about the survey boundaries being incorrect." "That's nonsense," Samuel said, but a cold feeling spread through his chest. Land disputes were common in the territory, and those with money and influence often won regardless of the truth. Maybe so, but Bradley's hired a lawyer from Cheyenne, and he's been talking to the bank manager. Carter looked genuinely distressed. "I thought you should be prepared." Margaret's hand found Samuel's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Carter. Would you like some coffee?" Carter shook his head. "Best be getting back. Store opens in an hour." He hesitated at the door. "One more thing. There's a group of Sioux camped about 5 miles north. They seem peaceful trading for supplies, but folks in town are nervous. Just be watchful." After he left, Samuel and Margaret stood in silence, absorbing this new information. "He's trying to steal the ranch legally," Margaret said finally. "That's what the meeting is about. He'll offer to buy us out before his lawyer discovers the title problem." Samuel nodded grimly. "And if we refuse, he'll tie us up in legal battles until the bank forecloses." "Can he really challenge your title?" "Anyone can challenge anything with enough money." Samuel paced the kitchen, his mind racing. "But my claim is legitimate. I fulfilled all the requirements, built a dwelling, cultivated the land, lived here continuously for 5 years before receiving final deed." Margaret watched him thoughtfully. "There's something you're not telling me." Samuel stopped pacing, caught by her perceptiveness. She weighted her gray eyes, patient but insistent. "During the war," he began slowly, "I wasn't just a scout for the Union Army. I was part of a special detachment operating behind Confederate lines. We did things, necessary things, but not always by the book." "You were a spy?" "Something like that." He rubbed his jaw, the memory uncomfortable. "After the war, there were bounties on some of us in certain southern states. Nothing official, but real enough. I came west, changed my name slightly. It was McKinney originally and started over. Margaret absorbed this without visible reaction. And Bradley knows, he must suspect at least. It would explain his confidence in challenging my title. If your identity were revealed, best case I'd face legal challenges that could take years to resolve. Worst case, bounty hunters. Samuel met her eyes directly. I should have told you before we married. I'm sorry. Instead of the anger or betrayal he expected, Margaret's expression held only thoughtful calculation. This actually gives us an advantage, she said after a moment. Bradley thinks he knows your secret, but he doesn't know that we know he knows. Despite the gravity of the situation, Samuel felt a smile tug at his lips. That's a lot of knowing. It means we can prepare. She reached for the ledger she'd been keeping. How much would it cost to hire our own lawyer to fight him properly? More than we have, especially with the bank loan coming due. Margaret tapped her pencil against the table, thinking. We need allies, and we need to find out exactly what Bradley's planning. The meeting, Samuel realized. If we both go, one of us could be watching Bradley while the other keeps an eye on Morrison. See if they give anything away. She nodded, warming to the strategy. And we should investigate the Sioux camp Carter mentioned, not because I believe they're a threat, but because Bradley might try to use them, somehow blame them for attacks on our stock, perhaps. Samuel studied his wife with growing admiration. She thought like a strategist, seeing connections and possibilities he might have missed. You would have made a good scout during the war? She smiled, the expression transforming her strong features. I would have made a terrible soldier. I question orders too much. The light moment faded as they returned to planning. By midday, they had formulated a response to Bradley's invitation. They would meet him in town on neutral ground, rather than at his ranch as he'd suggested. The public setting would provide some protection and allow them to gauge who else might be involved in Bradley's scheme. As they prepared to leave for town the next morning, bundling up against the bitter cold, Samuel found himself watching Margaret. She wore her practical work clothes, trousers beneath her skirt, for riding a man's coat that fit her broad shoulders better than any women's garment, her dark hair braided and pinned securely beneath a fur hat. She looked formidable, capable, nothing like the dainty bride he'd imagined when writing to the matrimonial agency. What? She asked, catching his gaze. Just thinking how lucky I am, he said honestly, that the agency ignored my requirements. She blushed, the color vivid against her winter-pale skin. Let's hope you still feel that way after we face Bradley. Cedar Ridge was quiet when they arrived, the main street nearly deserted in the grip of winter cold. They stabled their horses at the livery and walked to the hotel where they'd arranged to meet Bradley, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The hotel's small restaurant was warm after the bitter cold, outside the smell of coffee and baking bread. A welcoming contrast to the sterile winter landscape. Bradley sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee before him, his substantial frame straining the buttons of an expensive waistcoat. His eyebrows rose in surprise when he saw Margaret accompanying Samuel. "McKenna," he greeted, pointedly ignoring Margaret. "I expected you alone." "My wife has an equal stake in our ranch," Samuel replied, pulling out a chair for Margaret before sitting himself. "Anything you have to say can be said to both of us." Bradley's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "Of course. How progressive of you." A waitress brought coffee for Samuel and Margaret, then retreated quickly, sensing the tension at the table. "Your letter mentioned a proposition," Samuel said, getting straight to the point. Bradley leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "Indeed. I'll be direct, McKenna. Your ranch is failing. The bank's about to foreclose. You're injured, your stock is depleted, and winter's barely begun." "We're managing," Margaret interjected, her voice steady. Bradley's gaze flicked to her dismissive. For now, perhaps, but we all know it's just a matter of time. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the land enough to clear your debts and start fresh somewhere else. Perhaps back east, where the climate might better suit certain constitutions. His gaze lingered insultingly on Margaret's substantial frame. Samuel felt her stiffen beside him, but was impressed when she showed no other reaction to the slight. Our ranch isn't for sale, Samuel stated flatly. Bradley sighed as if disappointed but not surprised. I thought you might say that, which is why I feel obligated to mention certain irregularities I've discovered regarding your land title. What irregularities? Margaret asked, her tone innocent, but her eyes sharp. Questions about the original survey, boundary disputes, and most concerning issues with the identity of the claimant. Bradley's smile turned predatory. I understand the Homestead Act requires applicants to use their legal name, their true name. There it was, the threat Samuel had been expecting. He kept his expression neutral with effort. My title is valid Bradley, certified by the land office in Cheyenne. Certifications can be challenged, especially when fraud is involved. Bradley's voice dropped lower. I have friends in Virginia who would be very interested to learn the whereabouts of a certain Samuel McKinney, formerly of the Union Army's Special Scout Detachment. Margaret's hand found Samuel's under the table, squeezing once in warning. They had anticipated this, but hearing it stated so baldly still sent a chill through him. That's an interesting theory, Samuel replied evenly, but irrelevant to our land title. Is it? Bradley leaned forward. The courts might disagree. And legal battles are expensive, McKenna. Very expensive. Even if you eventually won, which you won't, the process would bankrupt you. The bank would foreclose long before any judgment. So your proposition is blackmail, Margaret said, her voice carrying just enough to make heads turn at nearby tables. Bradley's face darkened. Keep your voice down, woman. Why, she challenged. Are you ashamed of what you're doing? You should be. Margaret, Samuel cautioned, though he admired her spirit. Bradley's expression had turned ugly. You should control your wife McKenna before she causes more trouble than you can handle. My wife speaks for herself, Samuel replied, his own anger rising. And she's right. What you're proposing is blackmail, not a business deal. Call it what you will. Bradley's confidence returned. My offer stands until the end of the week. After that, I file my challenges both to your title and to your identity. Choose wisely. As he rose to leave, he added with false concern, Oh, and you might want to check your northern boundary when you return home. I heard there was some trouble with the Sioux camped nearby. Something about missing cattle. Shame if the army had to get involved. The threat couldn't have been clearer. Bradley was planning to steal their cattle and blame it on the Sioux, potentially triggering a violent response from the territorial authorities. After Bradley departed, Samuel and Margaret sat in silence, both processing the confrontation. He's going to move quickly, Margaret said finally. The threat about the Sioux wasn't idle. Samuel nodded grimly. We need to check the herd as soon as we get back, and warn the Sioux camp if we can. As they left the hotel, the street outside had grown busier with midday activity. Samuel was just helping Margaret onto her horse when a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A group of men had surrounded a solitary Indian, a young Sioux warrior by his dress, who had apparently come into town to trade. Filthy redskin, one man shouted, shoving the young warrior who stumbled but kept his balance, his face impassive. You and your kind been stealing our cattle. This isn't good, Samuel muttered, recognizing Bradley's foreman among the group of antagonists. They're trying to provoke an incident. Before he could decide how to intervene without making the situation worse, Margaret had already dismounted and was striding toward the confrontation. Her head high, her movements purposeful. "Gentlemen," her clear voice cut through the growing din. "Is this how Cedar Ridge welcomes visitors? Now, 6 men against 1. My, how brave you all must feel." The men turned toward her, momentarily distracted from their target. Bradley's foreman, a burly man named Hicks, spat on the ground near her feet. "Stay out of this, woman. This ain't your concern." "I believe it is," Margaret replied calmly. "Since you're accusing this man's people of stealing cattle, a serious charge that affects all ranchers in the area. Where's your proof, Mr. Hicks?" The young Sioux warrior watched Margaret with cautious assessment, clearly surprised by her intervention. "Don't need proof," Hicks growled. "Everyone knows Indians steal." "Everyone knows?" Margaret raised her eyebrows. "That's not evidence, Mr. Hicks. That's prejudice. And rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say, given that no one reported missing cattle until these people arrived to trade peacefully." Samuel had joined her now, standing at her shoulder, his hand near his gun. "Gentlemen, this man has done nothing wrong. Let him go about his business." "Or what McKenna?" Hicks challenged. "You and your big woman gonna make us—" Something flashed in Margaret's eyes, not hurt at the insult, but a cold determination that Samuel recognized from the night she'd faced down Morrison. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said pleasantly, "since Sheriff Harkins is watching this entire exchange from his office window. And I'm sure he'd be very interested to know why Bradley's men are suddenly so concerned about cattle theft when just yesterday Mr. Bradley himself mentioned trouble with the Sioux to us before anything had happened." Her bluff worked. Several men in the group glanced nervously toward the sheriff's office, and their resolve visibly weakened. "Come on, boys," Hicks muttered. "Ain't worth the trouble. We'll settle this another way." As the group dispersed, the young Sioux warrior inclined his head slightly to Margaret and Samuel. "Thank you," he said in careful English. "I am 2 Rivers." "Margaret McKenna," she replied, offering her hand, as she would to any man. After a moment's hesitation, he took it. "This is my husband Samuel. You should know that Bradley is planning something against your camp. He may try to blame your people for cattle theft." 2 Rivers nodded unsurprised. "We have seen his men watching our camp. My father Gray Horse has posted guards." "Gray Horse," Samuel repeated, a memory stirring. "The Sioux chief who fought at Bear Creek." "Yes." 2 Rivers studied Samuel with new interest. "You know my father." A complex emotion crossed Samuel's face. "We've met. During the war. Tell him Samuel McKinney sends his respects." 2 Rivers' eyes widened slightly at the name. "McKinney? My father speaks of a McKinney who saved his son during a battle with bluecoats." Samuel nodded once, his expression guarded. "That was a long time ago. Not so long that honor is forgotten." 2 Rivers touched his chest in a gesture of respect. "I will tell my father you are here. He will want to speak with you." After the young warrior departed, Margaret turned to Samuel, her expression questioning. "You saved his life." "It was during a skirmish in '63. Our detachment was ordered to clear a Sioux encampment that military intelligence claimed was harboring Confederate sympathizers." Samuel's voice had gone flat, the way it did when he spoke of the war. "When we arrived, we found only women, children, and a few warriors. No Confederates. No weapons, except for hunting rifles. The commanding officer ordered us to proceed anyway." Margaret's hand found his arm steady and supportive. "What did you do?" "I refused the order, convinced most of the other scouts to stand down too." The memory was clearly painful. There was confusion, shouting. A young warrior must have been— 2 Rivers was about to be shot. I knocked the rifle aside. You saved him, Margaret said softly, at great risk to yourself. Samuel shrugged uncomfortably. It was the right thing to do, but it ended my military career. I was discharged honorably, but with a reputation as a troublemaker. That's partly why I came west afterward, changed my name slightly. Wanted a fresh start. Margaret studied him, her gray eyes thoughtful. You're a good man, Samuel McKenna, or McKinney, whichever you prefer. McKenna, he said firmly. Samuel McKenna is who I am now, who I want to be. They remounted their horses, aware that curious eyes were watching from storefronts and windows. Bradley's confrontation at the hotel, followed by Margaret's intervention with the Sioux warrior, had guaranteed they were the subject of town gossip. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Samuel couldn't help noticing that Margaret sat straighter in her saddle, her expression more determined than worried. She had faced down Bradley and his men, without flinching, defended a stranger against injustice, and accepted Samuel's complicated past without judgment. Not for the first time, he found himself thinking how different she was from the bride he'd ordered, and how much more valuable. Bradley will retaliate, he said as they left the town behind. Today made him look weak. Margaret nodded, pulling her scarf higher against the biting wind. I'm counting on it. Angry men make mistakes. He's dangerous when angry. So am I. She flashed him a quick smile, fierce and beautiful in its determination. And I have more to fight for. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, each lost in thought. The landscape stretched white and pristine around them, the afternoon sun casting long blue shadows across the snow. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly merciless, much like the conflict they now faced. As they approached a narrow passage between two hills, Samuel felt a prickle of unease. The path ahead, bordered by steep slopes and scrubby pine, created a perfect natural ambush point. He reined in his horse, signaling Margaret to stop. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert. "Not sure." He scanned the ridgelines, looking for movement, any sign of watchers. "Just a feeling." Margaret didn't question his instinct. She moved her horse closer to his, her hand drifting toward the shotgun, secured to her saddle. "Another route. Too far, we'd lose daylight." Samuel studied the path ahead. "We'll proceed, but carefully. Stay close." They urged their horses forward at a walk, both hyper-aware of their surroundings. The only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath hooves and the occasional call of a winter bird. The tension built with each step, until Samuel felt his muscles aching with readiness. They were halfway through the passage when the attack came not from the ridgelines, as Samuel had expected, but from behind a massive snowdrift that concealed 3 mounted men. Morrison led them, his face twisted in a vengeful grin. "Afternoon, McKenna," he called, his rifle already raised. "Bradley sends his regards." Samuel reached for his gun, but he knew he was too late. Morrison had the drop on them, his finger already tightening on the trigger. The shot cracked through the winter air like breaking ice. The shot echoed through the narrow passage, but it wasn't Morrison who had fired. From the ridgeline above, a rifle cracked again, and one of Morrison's men pitched sideways off his horse with a startled cry. Samuel seized the moment of confusion to draw his own weapon, pushing Margaret behind the shelter of a large boulder. "Get down!" he shouted, as more shots rang out from the ridge. Morrison and his remaining man wheeled their horses, returning fire at the unseen attacker. Samuel risked a glance upward and caught a glimpse of movement, several figures in winter buckskins moving with practiced stealth among the rocks. "Sioux," he murmured to Margaret, who had her shotgun ready. "I think our friend Two Rivers sent an escort." Morrison must have realized the same cursing as he signaled to his companion. They retreated at a gallop, abandoning their fallen comrade in the snow. Within moments, they had disappeared around the bend in the trail. Samuel kept his rifle trained on the ridgeline, uncertain whether their rescuers were truly allies. Margaret remained beside him, her breathing steady despite the danger. "Hello, the ridge," Samuel called in the stillness that followed. "We mean no harm." A figure rose from the rocks above, tall and straight, despite his years. Even at this distance, Samuel recognized the proud bearing, the ceremonial feathers woven into gray-streaked braids. "Gray horse," he said softly. The Sioux chief raised his hand in greeting, then gestured to his companions. 4 warriors descended the slope with remarkable agility, their movements nearly silent in the deep snow. Gray Horse himself followed more deliberately, his dignity undiminished by age. "McKinney," he said when he reached them, his deep voice accented but clear. "Many winters since Bear Creek." Samuel inclined his head respectfully. "Many winters, Chief Gray Horse." "I go by McKenna now." The chief's weathered face showed no surprise. "New name, same heart." His dark eyes moved to Margaret, assessing. "Your woman is strong. She defended my son in the white man's town." Margaret straightened under his scrutiny, meeting his gaze directly. "Your son needed no defense, Chief Gray Horse. He conducted himself with dignity against those who had none." A flicker of approval crossed the chief's face. "Truth." He turned back to Samuel. "My son speaks of trouble. Men who would blame Sioux for cattle theft." "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "A rancher named Bradley wants our land. He plans to steal cattle and blame your people, hoping to provoke violence." Gray Horse nodded grimly. "Old story. White men fight, Indian dies." He gestured to the fallen rustler who lay motionless in the blood-stained snow. "This one followed you from town. Others wait ahead." Samuel exchanged a glance with Margaret. They had ridden straight into an ambush, and without the Sioux intervention might now be dead. "We owe you our lives," Margaret said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. Gray Horse shook his head. "No debt. McKinney saved my son. Now we save McKinney and his strong woman." He pointed down the trail. "But danger remains. Bradley's men watch your ranch. No safe return before dark." "You're offering us shelter," Samuel realized. The chief inclined his head. "Until sun rises. Then we plan." It was a generous offer and a pragmatic one. Attempting to reach the ranch with Morrison's men still lurking would be foolhardy, especially as daylight faded, and the opportunity to coordinate with the Sioux against Bradley's schemes could prove invaluable. "We accept with thanks," Samuel replied. One of the younger warriors approached, leading the dead rustler's horse. After a brief discussion in their native tongue, Gray Horse turned back to Samuel. "Come, camp not far." As they rode, flanked by the silent warriors, Samuel found himself studying Gray Horse. The chief had aged since their last encounter, but his presence remained commanding. During the war, he had been a formidable leader, respected even by his enemies. Now, like Samuel, he seemed to be seeking peace in his later years, a peace that Bradley threatened for both of them. Margaret rode close beside Samuel, her expression thoughtful. "I never expected to be guests in a Sioux camp," she said quietly. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked suddenly, concerned that he had accepted the invitation too readily. She shook her head, surprising him. "No, curious, yes. Cautious, certainly, but not afraid." She glanced at Gray Horse, who rode ahead with dignified, straight-backed posture. "He has honor. I can see it in how his men respect him." The Sioux camp lay nestled in a sheltered valley, protected from the worst of the winter winds by surrounding hills. Approximately 20 lodges formed a circle around a central fire area, with horses corralled nearby. Women moved about their evening tasks, children played in the snow, and elders sat wrapped in blankets outside their lodges. It was a scene of ordinary domestic life, starkly at odds with the fearsome image many settlers held of the Sioux. Their arrival caused a stir, curious eyes following as Gray Horse led them to a large lodge near the center of the camp. Two Rivers awaited them there, his expression relieved when he saw his father returning safely. "McKenna," he greeted, then nodded to Margaret. "Mrs. McKenna, you are welcome." Inside the lodge, warm furs covered the ground, and a small fire burned in a central pit, its smoke rising through an opening at the peak. Gray Horse gestured for them to sit, and an older woman, his wife Samuel, guessed, brought them steaming cups of some herbal tea. "Bradley is Snake," Gray Horse said without preamble once they were settled. "Speaks with forked tongue to Indian, to white man, to all. Wants all land, all water." "He's trying to drive us off our ranch," Samuel confirmed. "First with threats, now with violence." "Not just you." Gray Horse's expression darkened. 3 moons past Turner family leave valley. Bradley take land. Before that, Wilkins' widow go east. After husband die strange death. Bradley take land. Samuel exchanged a startled look with Margaret. "Ben Turner said he sold willingly. And Sarah Wilkins, I heard, she couldn't bear the memories after John died of fever." "No fever," Gray Horse said flatly. "Poison. My medicine woman find same sickness in stream near Wilkins' place after heavy rain. Water that feeds Bradley, land now." The implications were staggering. If Gray Horse was right, Bradley wasn't just a land-hungry bully, he was a murderer, systematically eliminating smaller ranchers to expand his holdings. "We need proof," Margaret said, her practical mind immediately grasping the situation. "Accusations without evidence will get nowhere with the territorial authorities." Gray Horse nodded in approval at her reasoning. "My hunters find cattle today, dead, cut to look like wolf kill but knife marks clear. Bradley men not careful." "Where?" Samuel asked. "North boundary of your land, near where 3 streams meet." Samuel knew the spot, a natural watering hole for cattle easily accessible from Bradley's property. The perfect place to stage a false wolf attack. "He's setting the stage," Margaret reasoned. "First cattle killed by wolves, then by Indians, building a story of dangerous conditions that make our ranch untenable. And giving him an excuse to call in the army against your people," Samuel added, looking at Gray Horse. "Creating a threat that doesn't exist." The chief's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes reflected grim understanding. "We have seen this before. It does not end well for my people." "It doesn't have to happen that way," Margaret said, leaning forward intently. "If we can prove what Bradley's doing, the fake attacks, the land fraud, possibly even murder, we can stop him." "White man's law protects white man," Gray Horse observed. "Not always," Samuel countered. "Sheriff Harkins is a fair man, and the territorial governor has been pushing for better relations with the tribes. If we bring solid evidence—" They talked long into the night, developing a strategy that grew increasingly bold. The Sioux would monitor Bradley's men, documenting their movements, and any attempts to stage further incidents. Samuel and Margaret would gather evidence of the land title fraud, while also preparing their ranch for the inevitable direct confrontation. "Bradley will come himself," Gray Horse predicted. "When smaller attacks fail, man like that believes in his own power." "Let him come," Margaret said, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "We'll be ready." Later, as they prepared to sleep in the guest section of Gray Horse's lodge, Samuel found himself watching Margaret with growing admiration. She had adapted to their unusual circumstances with remarkable poise, showing neither fear of their Sioux hosts nor hesitation in planning their defense. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly as they lay side by side on fur robes, the lodge quiet around them. She turned toward him in the dim light. "How so?" "Most women from Boston would be terrified to spend a night in a Sioux camp. You act as if it's perfectly ordinary." A small smile touched her lips. "I've never been most women, Samuel. That's rather the point, isn't it?" He reached out, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. The gesture felt more intimate than any they had shared before. "I'm beginning to think that's a blessing, not a disappointment." Her eyes widened slightly, and in the firelight he could see color rise in her cheeks. "Samuel!" Whatever she meant to say was interrupted by a soft sound at the lodge entrance. Two Rivers appeared, his expression urgent. "Riders," he said quietly. "Many. Coming from town direction." They rose quickly, following him outside. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky. From their elevated position they could see distant torches moving along the valley floor, at least a dozen riders following the trail toward the Sioux camp. "Bradley," Samuel muttered. "Must have tracked us here." Gray Horse materialized beside them, his face grim. "Too many for fight. Women, children here." "They're hoping for a fight," Margaret said. "It would give them the excuse they need to call in the army." Samuel's mind raced. They couldn't risk a violent confrontation that would endanger the Sioux, but neither could they simply surrender. Bradley would never let them leave alive, not now that they knew the extent of his schemes. "We need to split them up," he decided. "Draw them away from the camp." Gray Horse nodded in understanding. "My warriors can lead some away. False trails. Margaret and I will head for our ranch," Samuel continued. "If we can reach it before they catch us, we'll have a defensible position." "It's at least 10 miles through difficult terrain," Margaret pointed out. "In darkness. Gray Horse can provide a guide." Samuel looked to the chief, who nodded confirmation. "And we'll take the mountain route longer, but less exposed." Within minutes, preparations were complete. The Sioux women and children would retreat deeper into the hills, while warriors created diversions to split Bradley's force. Samuel and Margaret, accompanied by Two Rivers, as their guide, would attempt to reach the McKenna Ranch before dawn. As they prepared to depart, Gray Horse presented Samuel with a worn leather pouch. "Medicine," he explained, "for wounds, for strength. Old ways, but good." "Thank you, my friend," Samuel said, touched by the gesture. Gray Horse clasped his arm in the white man's style. "We fought as enemies once. We fight as brothers now." The night journey proved even more challenging than anticipated. Two Rivers led them along game trails barely visible in the darkness, up steep inclines, and through dense pine forests. The cold intensified as they climbed, their breath forming ice crystals on scarves and collars. Margaret never complained, though Samuel could see the strain in her face when moonlight occasionally broke through the trees. Her determination matched his own, her strength allowing them to maintain a pace that might have broken a more delicate woman. Halfway through the journey, they paused on a ridge to rest the horses and survey their back trail. In the valley below, they could see Bradley's men had indeed split up torches, moving in different directions as they pursued the false trails laid by the Sioux warriors. "It's working," Margaret whispered, her gloved hand finding Samuel's in the darkness. "For now," he cautioned. "But Bradley's no fool. He'll figure it out eventually." Two Rivers materialized beside them, silent as a shadow. "3 riders follow true trail," he reported. Bradley Morrison, one other. 1 hour behind, maybe less. Samuel nodded grimly. As he'd feared, Bradley had seen through the deception, at least partially. We need to keep moving. Can we reach the ranch before they catch us? Two Rivers considered. If horses strong, if snow holds firm. They pressed on the terrain, growing more difficult as they descended from the mountains toward the valley where the McKenna Ranch lay. The horses struggled in the deep snow, their strength flagging after hours of hard travel. Dawn was breaking when they finally caught sight of the ranch buildings in the distance, pale smoke rising from the chimney. Samuel felt a surge of hope at the sight. Someone had maintained the fire, perhaps one of the hands who occasionally stayed over. Almost there, he encouraged Margaret, whose face was drawn with exhaustion. She managed a tired smile. I've never been so glad to see that weathered old house. They had just started down the final slope when a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up snow mere feet from Margaret's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating her. "Ride!" Samuel shouted, spotting 3 mounted figures emerging from a stand of trees to their right. "Make for the barn!" They spurred their tired horses to a final effort, racing across the open ground toward the ranch buildings. More shots followed, but the distance and their speed made accuracy difficult for their pursuers. Two Rivers peeled away, heading for a different approach to the ranch, a prearranged tactic to divide Bradley's attention. Samuel and Margaret thundered into the ranch yard, leaping from their horses at the barn entrance. They drove the animals inside, then slammed and barred the heavy doors just as Bradley and his men reached the outer fence. "McKenna," Bradley's voice boomed across the yard, "you're harboring a hostile Indian consorting with enemies of decent folk. Come out and face justice." Samuel positioned himself at a small window rifle ready. Margaret checked the barn's other entrances, ensuring they were secure. "We need to get to the house," she said, keeping her voice low. "More ammunition there and better shelter." Samuel nodded. The barn was too vulnerable to fire its wooden walls and hay-filled loft, a potential death trap if Bradley decided to burn them out. "There's an old tunnel," he told her, "from the barn to the root cellar. Dug it during the early days when Indian raids were common." Margaret's eyes widened. "You never mentioned this." "Never had reason to." He moved to a corner of the barn, shifting aside empty grain barrels to reveal a trap door. "It's narrow and probably half collapsed, but it might be our only chance." Outside, they could hear Bradley organizing his men, spreading out to surround the barn. Time was running short. "I'll go first," Samuel said, lifting the trapdoor to reveal a dark opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The musty smell of earth and decay wafted up. "Follow, close behind me." The tunnel was worse than he remembered, tight, suffocating with sections where the roof had partially caved in. They crawled on their bellies through the narrowest parts, dirt showering down with each movement. Margaret's breathing grew labored behind him, and Samuel realized with a stab of concern that the confined space might be even more challenging for her larger frame. "Are you all right?" he whispered back to her. "Keep going," came her determined reply. "I'm right behind you." They had covered perhaps half the distance to the house when they heard muffled shouting from above, followed by the alarming sound of liquid splashing against the barn walls. "They're going to burn it," Margaret gasped. Samuel increased his pace, ignoring the pain as his injured shoulder scraped against the tunnel walls. Behind them, the first whoosh of flames consuming dry wood confirmed their fears. "Almost there," he encouraged, seeing a faint rectangle of light ahead, the access point to the root cellar. When they finally emerged, filthy and breathless, into the cramped space beneath the house, Samuel helped Margaret to her feet. She was trembling with exertion, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "You did it," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. She managed a weak smile. "Not what you expected when you ordered a slim bride, is it?" "No," he agreed, brushing dirt from her cheek with gentle fingers. "It's far better." The tender moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass above them. Bradley's men were forcing entry into the house. Samuel put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the narrow stairs leading up to the kitchen. They would have only seconds to surprise the intruders. Samuel went first, rifle ready, easing open the trap door that connected the root cellar to the kitchen pantry. He could hear boots on the wooden floor, men moving from room to room searching. "Check upstairs," Morrison's voice ordered. "Bradley wants them alive, if possible." Samuel caught Margaret's eye, signaling with quick hand gestures. She nodded, understanding, readying her shotgun. On his silent count of 3, they burst from the pantry into the kitchen. 2 of Bradley's men stood with their backs to them, unprepared for attack from that direction. Samuel's rifle butt caught the first across the back of the head, dropping him instantly. Margaret's shotgun leveled at the second, her voice steady. "Don't move." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Morrison," Samuel asked quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid alerting others in the house. "Upstairs with Bradley," the man muttered clearly, recognizing his precarious position. Samuel quickly bound and gagged both men, stashing them in the pantry. The house had gone ominously quiet, suggesting Bradley and Morrison were waiting in ambush upstairs. "We need a distraction," Margaret whispered. As if in answer to her words, a commotion erupted outside, shouts. A gunshot, the sound of galloping hooves. 2 Rivers. Samuel realized gratefully. The young warrior was creating a diversion. They heard hurried footsteps above as Morrison and Bradley reacted to the sounds. Samuel positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, rifle aimed upward. Margaret moved to cover the back door, preventing escape. Bradley appeared first, his substantial frame casting a shadow down the stairwell before he became visible. He froze mid-step when he saw Samuel's rifle trained on him. "It's over, Bradley," Samuel said evenly. "Your men are captured or scattered. The Sioux have evidence of your cattle killing. And I've sent documentation of your fraud to Sheriff Harkins." The last part was a bluff, but Bradley had no way of knowing that. His face purpled with rage. "You think this ends here, McKenna? I own half the territory. One word from me won't mean much when you're hanging for murder." Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying from her position by the door. "Gray Horse's medicine woman found poison in the stream near the Wilkins place. The same poison that killed John Wilkins." Bradley's composure cracked. "Lying Indian superstition, no court would, maybe not." Samuel agreed. "But once people start looking, they tend to find things. Sarah Wilkins might have questions about her husband's sudden death. Ben Turner might wonder why his cattle died after he refused your first offer. The bank might be interested in examining your loan documents more carefully." Morrison appeared behind Bradley, his cold eyes calculating. "We should just kill them, Tom. Blame it on the Indian. No one would question it." "Too late for that," Margaret said calmly. "Sheriff Harkins is already on his way. 2 Rivers went for him before creating that distraction." Another bluff, but delivered with such conviction that doubt flickered across Morrison's face. Bradley, however, had reached the limit of his restraint. With a roar of fury, he drew the pistol from his coat and fired wildly down the stairs. Samuel dove sideways, returning fire in a controlled shot that caught Bradley in the shoulder. The big man tumbled forward, crashing down the remaining steps to land in an undignified heap at the bottom. Morrison, seeing his employer fall, retreated back up the stairs. Morrison's escaping through the upstairs window, Margaret called, moving to pursue. Let him go, Samuel said, keeping his rifle trained on the groaning Bradley. We've got the one that matters. Bradley glared up at them, his wound bleeding, but not life-threatening. This isn't over, McKenna. Not by a long shot. I think it is, Samuel replied, as the distant sound of approaching horses reached them. That'll be the sheriff. Right on time. It wasn't the sheriff, as they discovered when they cautiously checked the approaching riders. Instead, Grey Horse led a group of his warriors with 2 Rivers riding beside him. They pulled up in the ranch yard, surveying the smoldering remains of the barn with stoic expressions. Bradley, Grey Horse inquired, as Samuel stepped onto the porch. Captured. Inside. Amanda nodded toward the house. Morrison escaped. The chief dismounted with the dignity of a man half his age. My scouts follow Morrison. He rides for town, probably to bring more men. Then we don't have much time, Margaret said, joining them on the porch. We need to get Bradley to the sheriff before Morrison returns with reinforcements. Grey Horse studied her with quiet approval. Strong woman. Good wife for McKenna. He turned back to Samuel. We will take Bradley to sheriff. White justice for white criminal. It was a generous offer and a politically astute one. By delivering Bradley to legal authorities rather than enacting their own vengeance, the Sioux would demonstrate their commitment to peaceful coexistence. Samuel nodded gratitude. Thank you, but it could be dangerous for your people in town. No more dangerous than here when Morrison returns, Grey Horse pointed out pragmatically. Better to face enemy in open with witnesses. The logic was sound. If they remained at the ranch, they would be outnumbered when Morrison returned with Bradley's remaining men. In town, with the sheriff and other witnesses present, even Bradley's influence might not be enough to save him from the mounting evidence. They bound Bradley securely and loaded him onto a spare horse. The man had gone ominously silent, his earlier bluster replaced by calculating stillness that worried Samuel more than his threats. Watch him carefully, he warned Grey Horse. He's dangerous even when wounded. The chief nodded understanding. We know snake when we see it. As the Sioux prepared to depart with their prisoner, 2 Rivers approached Samuel and Margaret. You have enemies still, he reminded them. Morrison will return with many rifles. We know, Samuel said grimly, but we need to stay and protect the ranch. It's all we have. 2 Rivers considered this, then spoke briefly with his father in their native tongue. Grey Horse nodded approval at whatever was suggested. I stay, 2 Rivers announced. Help defend home. Margaret looked surprised. That's generous, but very risky for you. The young warrior shrugged. McKenna saved my life once. Maybe I save his again. Samuel gripped 2 Rivers' arm in grateful acknowledgement. We would be honored by your help. After Grey Horse and his warriors departed with Bradley, the 3 of them took stock of their situation. The barn was badly damaged, but not completely destroyed. They could salvage much of the structure once the embers cooled. The house remained intact, and most importantly, the cattle and horses had been spared. Morrison will be back by nightfall, Samuel estimated, watching the western horizon. With every man Bradley can pay or intimidate. How many? 2 Rivers asked. 10, maybe 15. Bradley has resources. Margaret had been surveying the property with a strategic eye. We need to prepare. Create defensive positions. Secure the livestock. Set watches. They worked through the day, exhausted, but driven by necessity. 2 Rivers proved invaluable, his knowledge of defensive tactics complementing Samuel's military experience. Together, they transformed the ranch into a small fortress, overturning wagons for cover positioning rifles at key points establishing escape routes if needed. Margaret focused on practical necessities, preparing food, checking ammunition, ensuring medical supplies were ready. Her calm efficiency kept them organized despite the looming threat. As sunset approached, Samuel found her in the kitchen loading spare shotgun shells with steady hands. "You should rest," he suggested gently. "You've been going non-stop since yesterday." She shook her head, not pausing in her work. "I'll rest when this is over." "Margaret." He touched her shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles. "If this goes badly—" "It won't," she interrupted, finally looking up at him. "We've come too far, Samuel. I won't lose this ranch. I won't lose—" She stopped abruptly. "Lose what?" he asked softly. Her gray eyes met his directly. "You. This life we're building. I know it's not what you wanted initially, but it's become precious to me." The simple honesty of her statement struck him deeply. This woman who had endured his disappointment and prejudice, who had fought beside him and saved him more than once, was declaring the value of their shared life, a life he had initially resented. "Margaret," he began, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "When I wrote to that agency, I thought I knew exactly what I needed. I was a fool." He took the shotgun shell from her hands, setting it aside so he could hold both her strong, capable hands in his. "You are everything I didn't know to ask for. Your strength, your courage, your determination, they've saved this ranch. They've saved me." He squeezed her hands gently. "If we survive this, I want to start again. Not as a marriage of convenience, but as real partners. If that's what you want." The vulnerability in his last words hung between them. For all her strength, Margaret had her own wounds, years of rejection for being too substantial, too strong, too much. Samuel had added to those hurts with his initial disappointment. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she freed one hand from his grasp and brought it to his face. Her touch surprisingly gentle for hands that could split firewood and fire a shotgun with equal skill. "Samuel McKenna," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion in her eyes. "I crossed a continent to marry a stranger because I believed I had no value except as a wife, any wife, even to a man who wanted someone entirely different. But here with you, fighting for this land, I've found something I never expected." "What's that?" he asked, heart-pounding. "Myself," she replied simply. "My own worth. And yes, I want to be your partner, your true partner, if we survive this. But not because I need you to validate my existence, because we're stronger together than apart." Samuel felt something tight and painful in his chest finally release a knot of grief and guilt he had carried since Martha's death. He had loved his first wife deeply, but their relationship had been built on his protection and her dependence. What Margaret offered was something entirely different, a partnership of equals, each bringing their own strength to the union. Before he could respond, Two Rivers appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "Riders coming, many, from west." The moment shattered reality, reasserting its demands. Samuel and Margaret moved to the window, peering out at the darkening landscape. In the distance, a line of torches marked Morrison's approach, at least 12 riders, maybe more. "They'll be here within the hour," Samuel said grimly. "Two Rivers take the north position as we planned. Margaret." "I'll cover the south approach," she finished, already reaching for her shotgun. "The wagon barricade gives the best field of fire." Samuel wanted to protest to place her in the safest position, but he knew better now. Margaret was a fighter, not someone to be sheltered. She was most valuable where her shooting skills could be best utilized. "Be careful," he said instead. She smiled, that fierce, beautiful expression he had come to cherish. "You too. We have plans for after Remember, as they moved to their defensive positions, Samuel found himself thinking not of the coming battle, but of the future Margaret had hinted at. A true partnership, a life built together. It was so different from what he had envisioned when writing to the matrimonial agency, and infinitely more valuable. The approaching riders were visible now, silhouetted against the evening sky. Morrison led them, his tall figure unmistakable even at this distance. They slowed as they neared the ranch, perhaps surprised by the lack of obvious activity. "Spread out," Morrison's voice carried in the still air. "They're in there somewhere. Bradley wants them alive if possible, dead if necessary." Samuel settled behind his cover rifle, steady. Across the yard he could see Margaret in position, her face calm and focused. Two Rivers had vanished into the shadows, prepared to strike from an unexpected quarter. As Morrison's men dismounted and began to advance cautiously toward the house, Samuel thought about the bride he had ordered, slim, obedient, demure, and the woman who had arrived instead. In that moment, he couldn't imagine facing this threat with anyone else beside him. "McKenna!" Morrison shouted. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and maybe we'll let your woman live." Samuel remained silent, waiting for Morrison's men to move into the carefully prepared killing zone they had established. Beside him lay Gray Horse's medicine pouch, a reminder of unexpected alliances and second chances. The standoff had begun. With night falling and tensions rising, the final confrontation for the McKenna Ranch and for Samuel and Margaret's future was moments away from erupting into violence. Morrison's men advanced in a ragged line, their confidence betraying their inexperience. Real gunmen would have approached with more caution, using available cover, moving in coordinated pairs. These were ranch hands and drifters, not hardened fighters, dangerous in their numbers, but vulnerable to a well-planned defense. Samuel held his position, waiting until the first men reached the predetermined range. At his side lay 3 loaded rifles, allowing him to fire in rapid succession without pausing to reload. Across the yard, Margaret remained perfectly still behind her barricade, only her eyes moving as she tracked the approaching threat. The first shot came not from Samuel or Margaret, but from 2 Rivers positioned on the roof of the damaged barn. The bullet struck the ground at Morrison's feet, a warning rather than a killing shot. The effect was immediate. Morrison's men scattered, diving for whatever cover they could find, their formation dissolving into chaos. Samuel seized the moment, firing 3 rapid shots that took down 2 of Morrison's men. Not killing shots, he aimed for legs and shoulders, but enough to remove them from the fight. Margaret's shotgun boomed from her position, the scatter pattern driving 3 more attackers back behind a water trough. "They're everywhere!" One of Morrison's men shouted, panic evident in his voice. "Must be a dozen of them!" The illusion of a larger defending force was working. With shots coming from multiple positions and their own men falling, Morrison's courage was faltering. "Hold your ground!" Morrison bellowed, firing wildly toward Samuel's position. "It's just McKenna and his fat wife Bradley will pay double to whoever brings me their heads." The crude insult sparked something in Samuel, not the embarrassment he might have felt weeks ago, but pure, righteous anger. This man had threatened not just his land, but Margaret, strong, brave Margaret, who had faced every challenge without flinching. Samuel lined up his next shot, carefully aiming not to wound, but to kill. Morrison was the key. Without his leadership, the others would likely flee. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Samuel, no!" Margaret's voice cut through the gunfire. "Not like this!" Her call broke his concentration. Morrison dove behind an overturned cart, temporarily out of sight. Samuel glanced toward Margaret's position, questioning. "We need him alive," she called, ducking as bullets splintered the wood near her head, "to testify against Bradley." She was right, of course. Killing Morrison might end the immediate threat, But without his testimony linking Bradley to the attempted land grab and violence, the powerful rancher might still escape justice. They needed both men alive to ensure the conspiracy was fully exposed. Samuel adjusted his strategy, focusing on disabling rather than killing their attackers. The firefight continued with Morrison's men gradually being picked off wounded or driven back by the coordinated defense. Two Rivers proved especially effective, changing positions frequently to give the impression of multiple defenders. His arrows, silent and deadly, created additional confusion among the attackers. "This ain't worth dying for," one of Morrison's men shouted, retreating toward the horses. "Bradley ain't paying us enough for this." Others began to follow, ignoring Morrison's threats and curses. Within minutes, half his force had abandoned the fight, galloping away into the darkness. Morrison, realizing his position was collapsing, made a desperate decision. Emerging from cover, he sprinted not away from the ranch, but toward it, specifically toward Margaret's position. Samuel saw the danger too late. "Margaret, behind you!" She turned, but Morrison was already upon her, vaulting over the wagon barricade with surprising agility. His pistol swung toward her face as he landed. What happened next would be etched in Samuel's memory forever. Instead of freezing or cowering, Margaret dropped her shotgun and surged upward, her substantial frame driving into Morrison with the force of a charging bull. The impact knocked his arm aside, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the air. Morrison staggered backward, momentarily stunned by the unexpected counterattack. Margaret pressed her advantage, delivering a solid punch to his midsection that doubled him over. "You," Morrison gasped, struggling to regain his breath. "Bitch! Strong, bitch!" Margaret corrected, ducking his wild swing and delivering another blow that sent him sprawling. "And I'm getting tired of men like you underestimating me." Samuel was racing across the yard, desperate to reach them, when Morrison produced a hidden knife. The blade flashed in the dim light as he lunged, catching Margaret across the arm. She cried out, blood darkening her sleeve, but didn't retreat. Instead, she seized Morrison's wrist with both hands, using her weight and strength to force the knife away. They struggled, locked together in a desperate contest of wills and muscle. Samuel reached them just as Margaret drove Morrison backward into the side of the wagon. The impact loosened his grip on the knife, and Margaret wrenched it from his hand, tossing it aside. "It's over, Morrison," Samuel said, pressing his rifle barrel against the man's chest. "Your men are gone. Bradley's in custody. You've lost." Morrison's cold eyes darted between them, calculating even in defeat. "Bradley has friends, powerful friends. You think this ends here? You're dead already, McKenna. You just don't know it yet." "Maybe," Samuel acknowledged, "but you'll hang first." They bound Morrison securely using leather straps from the damaged harnesses. The remaining attackers had fled, leaving their wounded comrades behind. Two Rivers appeared from the shadows, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good fight," he said simply. "Sheriff comes." He pointed toward the eastern horizon, where distant riders were visible in the moonlight. Margaret was examining her arm, the knife wound still bleeding freely. Samuel moved to her side, concern etched on his face. "How bad?" "Deep but clean," she assessed with remarkable calm. "I'll need stitches." Samuel tore a strip from his shirt, binding the wound temporarily. "I'm sorry I didn't reach you sooner." She looked up at him, her gray eyes steady despite the pain. "I handled it, didn't I?" "You certainly did." He couldn't keep the admiration from his voice. "Remind me never to make you truly angry." A smile tugged at her lips. "Too late for that warning, I think." The approaching riders turned out to be Sheriff Harkins and his deputies, accompanied by Grey Horse and several of his warriors. They had already secured Bradley in the Cedar Ridge jail and had come to investigate reports of gunfire at the McKenna Ranch. "Looks like you've been busy," Harkins observed dryly, surveying the aftermath of the battle. "Bradley's been spitting threats about you since we locked him up. Something about Indian conspiracies and land fraud." "Projecting his own crimes," Samuel explained, keeping one hand supportively on Margaret's uninjured arm. "Bradley's been systematically driving out smaller ranchers, possibly even murdering some. When we discovered his schemes, he tried to eliminate us too." Harkins nodded, unsurprised. "Always suspected something wasn't right with that man. Too rich, too quick." He gestured toward the wounded Morrison. "This one part of it, Bradley's enforcer," Margaret confirmed. "Responsible for multiple attacks on our ranch, attempted murder, cattle rustling. And he can testify to Bradley's involvement in all of it." The sheriff's weathered face showed grudging respect as he took in Margaret's injury and composed demeanor. "Mrs. McKenna, you're not what most folks expected when they heard about Sam's mail-order bride." "So I've been told," she replied dryly. "Turns out what I expected wasn't what I needed." Samuel added, his arm sliding around Margaret's waist in a gesture both protective and proud. With Morrison and the wounded attackers in custody, and Grey Horse's warriors providing statements about the cattle killings staged to look like wolf attacks, the evidence against Bradley mounted quickly. Harkins was confident both men would face justice, though he warned the legal process might be lengthy, given Bradley's connections. "The territorial governor is a fair man," he assured them as he prepared to depart. "Once he hears about Bradley's attempts to provoke conflict with the Sioux, he'll take a personal interest. Peaceful relations with the tribes is his priority." After the sheriff and his prisoners had gone, Samuel, Margaret, and Two Rivers assessed the damage to the ranch. The barn would need significant repairs, and several fences had been destroyed in the fighting. But the house remained intact, the livestock secure, and most importantly, they had survived. Two Rivers declined their invitation to stay the night, explaining that he needed to return to his people. "Grey Horse will want to know all is well," he said. "I will come tomorrow. Help rebuild barn." After the young warrior departed, Samuel and Margaret were finally alone. The tension of the past days drained away, leaving them exhausted but strangely elated. They had faced the worst Bradley could throw at them and had emerged victorious. In the kitchen, Samuel carefully cleaned and stitched Margaret's wound, his hands gentle despite their size and roughness. She sat stoically through the procedure, only the occasional tightening around her eyes betraying her pain. "You were magnificent today," he said as he tied off the final stitch. "I've seen trained soldiers with less courage." She looked down at her arm, now neatly bandaged. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but not of Morrison or his men. I was afraid of losing this, our home, our life together. It's become more precious to me than I expected." Samuel's hand covered hers, his touch reverent. "When I saw Morrison attack you, I thought my heart would stop. Not because I doubted your strength, but because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." She met his gaze, a question in her storm-gray eyes. "Because I'm useful to the ranch." "Because I love you," he said simply. The words, unplanned but utterly true, hung in the air between them. "Not for your usefulness, though God knows you're more capable than any 3 normal people. Not for what you can do, but for who you are." Margaret's composure, maintained through gunfights and knife wounds, finally cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd hear those words," she whispered. "Not from anyone, and certainly not from you. Not after seeing your disappointment when I stepped off that train." Samuel winced at the memory. "I was a fool," blinded by grief and rigid expectations. I thought I needed another Martha, someone delicate I could protect and shelter. I didn't realize what I truly needed was a partner strong enough to stand beside me, brave enough to face whatever comes. "And large enough to break your bed," she added with a watery smile, referring to the incident weeks earlier when the old bed frame had finally collapsed under their combined weight. He laughed, the sound rich with genuine joy. "Especially that." Samuel drew her gently into his arms, mindful of her injury. Margaret came willingly, her solid warmth fitting against him, as if designed for that purpose. When their lips met, it wasn't the dutiful kiss of their wedding day, but something new, a promise, a beginning, a partnership sealed with genuine passion. Winter gave way to spring, the snow melting to reveal green shoots pushing through the Wyoming soil. The McKenna Ranch underwent its own rebirth with repairs and improvements transforming the once struggling homestead. Bradley's trial became the sensation of the territory, with Morrison turning state's evidence to save his own neck and Gray Horse's people providing crucial testimony about the staged cattle killings. The powerful rancher's empire crumbled. When evidence emerged linking him to John Wilkins's mysterious death, the final nail was driven into the coffin of his defense. Samuel's own history came to light during the proceedings, but rather than the disgrace Bradley had anticipated, the revelation that Samuel McKenna had once been Samuel McKinney, the scout who had refused an order to attack innocent Sioux, only enhanced his standing in the community. The territorial governor, committed to improved relations with the tribes, publicly commended Samuel's moral courage. "You're a local hero now," Margaret teased one evening as they sat on their newly built porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. "The famous Samuel McKinney, defender of justice." He snorted, comfortable enough now to accept her gentle ribbing. "I'd rather be Samuel McKenna, unremarkable rancher with a remarkable wife." She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. In the months since the confrontation with Bradley, Margaret had flourished. Always strong, she had now developed a quiet confidence that drew respect from even the most traditional corners of the community. "I received a letter from Boston today," she said, her voice thoughtful. "From my brother Edward." Samuel tensed slightly. Margaret's family had essentially abandoned her, making it clear she was a burden they were glad to be rid of. What did he want? To apologize, apparently. She sounded as surprised as Samuel felt. His wife died last winter, influenza. He wrote that her passing made him reflect on how he treated me after our parents died. He asked forgiveness and whether he might visit sometime. "Do you want to see him?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think I do. Not because I need his approval anymore, but because I'm proud of the life we've built. I want him to see that the sister he considered unmarriageable has found something wonderful." Samuel squeezed her hand, understanding her complex emotions. "Then we'll welcome him when he comes. Show him what a McKenna ranch looks like when it's thriving." The ranch was indeed thriving. With Margaret's practical management and Samuel's ranching skills, they had not only repaid the bank loan, but had begun to expand their operations. The new barn, larger and sturdier than its predecessor, housed an expanding herd of quality cattle. The chicken coop Margaret had insisted on building now produced enough eggs to sell in town, providing a steady income even when cattle prices fluctuated. Most significantly, they had established a lasting peace with Gray Horse's people. The Sioux chief had become a regular visitor, often accompanied by Two Rivers. Their knowledge of the land and its seasons proved invaluable, while Samuel and Margaret provided goods and advocacy with territorial authorities in return. 5 years after Margaret had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, 5 years after Samuel had looked at her substantial frame with dismay and disappointment, they sat together on a new porch swing, watching their children play in the yard. Little Martha, 4 years old, with her mother's dark curls and sturdy build, was carefully instructing her younger brother James in the proper way to feed the chickens. The boy, barely 3, and named for Samuel's father, listened with the solemn attention he brought to everything, his slender frame reminiscent of Samuel's first wife, but his determined expression pure Margaret. "They're perfect," Samuel murmured, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Both of them." Margaret smiled, her free hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where their third child grew. "Even though Martha's built like me, you don't worry. She'll be too big, too strong." There was no sting in the question now, just gentle teasing about old wounds long healed. "I pray she'll be exactly like you," Samuel replied with complete sincerity. "Strong enough to know her own worth, brave enough to fight for what matters, wise enough to see beyond appearances. And with a good enough aim to drive off rustlers," Margaret added with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Especially that." He kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Though I hope she never needs that particular skill." The territory was changing around them. The railroad had brought more settlers, towns were growing into cities, and the open range was gradually giving way to fenced properties and formal boundaries. The days of rustlers like Morrison and land barons like Bradley were fading, replaced by courts, contracts, and commerce. But the McKenna Ranch remained a place apart, not stuck in the past, but preserving the best of it while embracing the future. Samuel and Margaret had expanded their original homestead, but always with respect for the land and its original inhabitants. Gray Horse's people continued to hunt on portions of their property by mutual agreement, maintaining traditions while adapting to new realities. As twilight deepened into evening, Samuel called the children in for supper. Martha came running immediately, always eager for her mother's cooking. James lingered, fascinated by a beetle crawling across a fence post. "Come on, little man," Samuel encouraged, scooping up his son. "Your mama's made apple pie for dessert." Inside the expanded house, the kitchen glowed with warmth and light. Margaret moved about the space with the same efficiency she brought to everything, her substantial frame now a source of comfort rather than consternation to Samuel. She had set the table with the everyday dishes, keeping Martha's fine china for special occasions. "Wash up, everyone," she directed, sliding a golden-crusted pie onto the windowsill to cool. "Especially you, Miss Martha. Those eggs leave your hands a mess." Their daughter giggled, allowing Samuel to lift her to the wash basin. "Papa, tell the story about when you met Mama at the train station." Samuel exchanged an amused glance with Margaret. This had become a favorite bedtime tale, though they had edited certain aspects for young ears. "Again, I told it just last week." "Please," Martha's gray eyes, so like her mother's, widened pleadingly. "It's my favorite." Over supper, Samuel recounted the story of writing to the matrimonial agency, of specifying a slim bride, of his surprise when Margaret stepped off the train. He described their awkward beginning, the gradual discovery of her worth, and the final realization that she was exactly what he needed, though not what he had thought he wanted. The children, despite having heard the tale many times, listened with rapt attention. Even James, usually squirming by the end of meals, sat quietly absorbed in the familiar narrative. "And then," Samuel concluded, winking at Margaret, "your mama broke my bed." "Samuel," Margaret protested, though her eyes danced with humor. "Not that part." Martha giggled delightedly. "Because Mama's strong." "The strongest," Samuel agreed. "Strong enough to save the ranch, strong enough to save Papa, strong enough to build a family more precious than gold." Later, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Margaret stood on the porch, gazing at the star-filled Wyoming sky. The night was cool, but not cold, the promise of summer in the gentle breeze. 5 years, Margaret mused, leaning against him. Sometimes it feels like yesterday I stepped off that train terrified you'd send me straight back when you saw me. And sometimes it feels like you've always been here. Samuel replied, his arm secure around her waist. Like this ranch wasn't complete until you arrived. She turned in his embrace, her gray eyes serious in the moonlight. Do you ever regret it? Writing to that agency, specifying requirements they ignored. Samuel considered the question honestly. I regret my blindness, my narrow vision of what a wife should be. But writing that letter, he shook his head. Never. It brought you to me, however mistakenly. And that was the best fortune of my life. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her strong features into true beauty. Mine too, even if I did break your bed. Especially because you broke my bed, he corrected, drawing her closer. It was the beginning of breaking all my rigid expectations, my preconceptions, of rebuilding something far better in their place. Inside the house in their bedroom stood the evidence of that rebuilding, a massive oak bed frame specially constructed by the finest carpenter in the territory. Built not for a slim, delicate woman, but for a substantial, strong one, and the man who had learned to love her exactly as she was. We should check on the children once more. Margaret suggested, practical as always. Samuel nodded, but didn't release her immediately. Instead, he held her gaze in the silver moonlight, needing her to understand the depth of his feeling. I ordered a slim bride, he said softly, and got a woman strong enough to carry not just herself, but me, our children, this ranch, through whatever comes. I couldn't be more grateful for that mistake. Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. And I married a stranger expecting disappointment, and finding instead a man willing to see beyond appearances to the person beneath. We both got more than we bargained for. As they moved back inside arm in arm, the stars continued their eternal dance above the McKenna Ranch. The land that had witnessed their struggles and triumphs remained harsh and beautiful, demanding and rewarding, much like life itself. In a distant corner of the property, near where 3 streams met, wildflowers had begun to bloom on the graves of those who had passed. Martha McKenna laid to rest with love and respect. John and Sarah Wilkins eventually reunited after Bradley's dark deeds were exposed. Even Tom Bradley himself, who had died in territorial prison, his empire dismantled and distributed among those he had wronged. Life moved forward as it always did in the West. New challenges would come, new joys and sorrows. But Samuel and Margaret McKenna would face them as they had faced everything since finding their way to each other together, stronger for their differences, united in purpose and in love. The old saying claimed that the Lord works in mysterious ways. Looking at the family he had never expected, but now couldn't imagine living without Samuel McKenna. Could only agree. He had ordered a slim bride, but received instead the perfect partner for the life he was meant to live. A woman whose strength matched the land itself, whose heart was big enough to encompass all he had to give, and whose love had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes what you think you want isn't what you truly need. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate indeed, life gives you exactly what you need, whether you knew to ask for it or not. The end.